The rifle shot echoed across the Texas prairie as Eleanor Turner stood on her porch, smoke curling from the Winchester in her hands. The outlaw crumpled to the dust, and the remaining gang members froze. This wasn't the quiet, submissive bride Jacob Turner had ordered from back east. This was something else entirely, a force of nature wrapped in calico and steel. Want to know how a proper Eastern lady became the most feared woman in West Texas? Stay with me until the end of this wild tale, and don't forget to comment your city below. I'd love to see how far this story travels. The autumn sun hung low over the Texas frontier, painting the vast expanse of grassland in shades of amber and rust. Jacob Turner stood on the wooden platform of the Sweetwater station, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his hat, as he watched the horizon for the telltale plume of smoke that would signal the arrival of the westbound train. October 15th, 1883. A date he'd circled on his calendar 3 months prior, when he'd sent his letter and photograph to the matrimonial news agency in Chicago. At 34, Jacob had built his ranch from nothing but sweat, determination, and a small inheritance from his late father. The Double J Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, with a sturdy 2-story house he'd constructed himself board by board, nail by nail. He had everything a man could want in this harsh country, except companionship. The loneliness had crept up on him slowly like morning frost on autumn grass, until one day he'd found himself talking to his horses more than any human being. "She'll be quiet," he muttered to himself, rehearsing the qualities he'd specifically requested in his correspondence. Modest, gentle, skilled in household duties. Someone who understands the value of silence and hard work. The other ranchers had warned him about mail-order brides. Tom Mackenzie from the neighboring spread had gotten himself a woman from Philadelphia who'd taken one look at the Texas dust and caught the next train back east. But Jacob had been specific in his requirements. He'd asked for someone plain, someone without grand expectations or romantic notions, someone who wouldn't disturb the careful rhythm of his life. The train's whistle pierced the afternoon air, and Jacob straightened his vest, running a hand through his dark hair that had just begun to show threads of silver at the temples. His heart hammered against his ribs as the locomotive approached, belching black smoke into the crystal-clear sky. This was it, the moment that would change everything, though he had no idea just how much. The train groaned to a stop, steam hissing from its iron belly like some great metal dragon catching its breath. Passengers began to disembark, cowboys heading to the cattle drives. Merchants with their sample cases, families seeking new beginnings in the unforgiving West. Jacob's eyes scanned each face, looking for the woman from the photograph the agency had sent. Miss Eleanor Hayes, 26 years old, formerly of Boston, Massachusetts. The photograph had shown a woman with dark hair pulled back severely, wearing a high-collared dress that spoke of propriety and restraint. Perfect, he'd thought. Exactly what he needed. Then he saw her. She stood at the top of the train steps, and for a moment Jacob forgot to breathe. The photograph hadn't lied exactly, but it hadn't told the whole truth either. Eleanor Hayes was indeed wearing a modest traveling dress of deep blue wool, her dark hair pinned up beneath a practical bonnet. But there was something in the way she held herself. Something in the tilt of her chin and the directness of her gaze that made Jacob's carefully planned greeting die on his lips. Her eyes found his across the platform, green as spring grass after rain, with gold flecks that caught the afternoon light. There was intelligence there, sharp and assessing, and something else. Fire. The kind of fire that could warm a home or burn it to the ground depending on how it was tended. Eleanor descended the steps with a grace that seemed at odds with the rough wooden platform and the dust that swirled around her feet. She carried a single carpet bag, refusing the porter's offer of assistance with a polite but firm shake of her head. As she approached Jacob, he noticed the way her gloved hands gripped the bag's handle, not with delicate femininity, but with purpose and strength. "Mr. Turner." Her voice was cultured with the crisp consonants of a Boston education, but there was steel beneath the silk. "Yes, ma'am. Miss Hayes." Jacob removed his hat, clutching it against his chest like a shield. "Eleanor, please." She extended her hand, and when Jacob took it, her grip was firm, confident. "I appreciate you meeting me. The journey was educational." Educational? Jacob found himself asking, caught off guard by her choice of words. A smile played at the corners of her mouth. Not the demure, practiced smile he'd expected, but something genuine and slightly mischievous. I've learned that Texas dust has a particular talent for finding its way into everything one owns, that the gentlemen in the smoking car have very colorful vocabulary when they think no ladies are listening, and that your frontier sunsets are every bit as magnificent as the guidebooks claimed. Jacob blinked, unsure how to respond. This wasn't going according to his mental script. She was supposed to be overwhelmed, perhaps a little frightened. He was supposed to be reassuring, protective. Instead, Eleanor Hayes stood before him as if she'd been born to this place, as if the wild Texas wind recognized her as kin. "I've arranged for us to be married tomorrow," Jacob said, falling back on the practical matters he'd planned. "Reverend Morrison at the church in town. Then we'll head out to the ranch. It's about an hour's ride." "Tomorrow?" Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "Rather eager, aren't we, Mr. Turner?" Heat crept up Jacob's neck. "I thought, that is, I assumed you'd want to get settled quickly, but if you need time to—" "Tomorrow is perfect," Eleanor interrupted, that mysterious smile returning. "I didn't travel 2,000 miles to waste time with unnecessary delays, though I do hope you have a horse I might ride. I've been trapped in that train car for 5 days, and I'm eager to see this land of yours properly." You ride?" The question escaped before Jacob could stop it. Her letters hadn't mentioned that particular skill. Among other things, she picked up her carpetbag with ease despite its obvious weight. "Shall we collect the rest of my belongings? I had several trunks loaded into the cargo car." Several trunks. Jacob had expected one, maybe two. He followed Eleanor along the platform, his mind racing to adjust his expectations. The woman walking beside him moved with confidence, her head turning to take in the dusty streets of Sweetwater, the false-fronted buildings, the cowboys lounging outside the saloon. Where he expected to see fear or disgust, he saw only curiosity and calculation. The cargo master, a grizzled man named Hank, greeted them with a gap-toothed grin. "These your trunks, ma'am." He gestured to a collection of luggage that made Jacob's heart sink. 4 large trunks and 2 smaller cases, all well made and bearing the marks of extensive travel. "Yes, thank you." Eleanor supervised the unloading with the efficiency of a general deploying troops, directing Jacob and Hank in the placement of each piece on the wagon Jacob had brought to town. "That's a lot of fancy dresses," Jacob commented, trying to keep the worry from his voice. He'd built a functional home, not a palace. "Where would all this go?" Eleanor laughed. Not the tittering giggle of the town ladies, but a rich, genuine sound that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep inside her. "Dresses, Mr. Turner, 1 trunk contains books. Another holds medical supplies and household remedies. The third has tools and equipment I thought might be useful on a ranch. Only 1 trunk, and the 2 cases contain clothing, and I assure you they're quite practical." "Books," Jacob repeated, feeling like an echo. "Medical supplies, tools. Did you think you were marrying a decorative object, Mr. Turner?" There was a challenge in her voice now, though her tone remained pleasant. "I may be from Boston, but I'm not entirely ignorant of what life on a ranch requires. I've spent the last 6 months preparing for this." 6 months. While he'd been imagining a quiet, biddable wife who would cook his meals and mend his clothes, she'd been preparing, planning. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. They loaded the wagon in relative silence after that, though Jacob caught Eleanor watching him with those unsettling green eyes. When everything was secured, he helped her onto the wagon seat, though she hardly needed his assistance gathering her skirts and climbing up with practiced ease. "Before we go to the hotel," Eleanor said as Jacob took his place beside her, "might we stop at the general store? There are a few things I'd like to purchase." "Of course." Jacob guided the horses down Main Street, acutely aware of the stares they were attracting. Sweetwater was a small town, and everyone knew Jacob Turner had sent for a mail-order bride. By evening, every detail of Eleanor's appearance and behavior would be dissected over dinner tables and whiskey glasses. At Morrison's general store, Eleanor moved through the aisles with purpose, selecting items with careful consideration. Coffee, flour, sugar, the expected purchases. But also ammunition for a rifle, a sturdy pair of men's work gloves and a small-sized leather conditioning oil, and a collection of seed packets that made old Mr. Morrison raise his eyebrows. Planning on doing some gardening, Miss Hayes, Morrison asked, his tone suggesting that gardening in West Texas was a fool's errand. Among other things, Eleanor replied smoothly, adding a bolt of sturdy cotton fabric to her purchases. One can't eat beef every meal, Mr. Morrison, and I've heard that with proper irrigation and care, quite a variety of vegetables can thrive here. Irrigation, Morrison snorted. You'd need water for that, miss, and water's scarce in these parts. Then we'll have to be creative, won't we? Eleanor's smile never wavered, but Jacob saw the steel in it now. She wasn't going to be discouraged by the pessimism of a store clerk. As Morrison tallied their purchases, Eleanor moved to the window, studying the street outside with that same intense curiosity. Jacob joined her, following her gaze to where a group of women had gathered outside the millinery shop, their heads bent together in obvious gossip. "The welcoming committee, I presume?" Eleanor asked dryly. "Mrs. Pritchard and her circle," Jacob confirmed. "They have opinions about everything that happens in Sweetwater." "I'm sure they do." Eleanor turned from the window, and Jacob caught a glimpse of something in her expression, not fear or apprehension, but a kind of anticipation, like a fighter sizing up an opponent. "Tell me, Mr. Turner, what exactly have you told people about me?" "Just that you were coming from back east, that we'd corresponded through the agency. And what kind of woman did you tell them you were expecting?" Jacob felt heat creep up his neck again. "I might have mentioned that I was looking for someone quiet. Modest?" Eleanor's laugh rang out again, drawing startled looks from Morrison and the other customers in the store. "Oh, Mr. Turner, I'm afraid you're going to be quite disappointed." "Are you not modest?" Jacob asked, genuinely confused. Everything about her appearance suggested propriety. "I suppose that depends on one's definition of modesty." Eleanor gathered their wrapped purchases with efficient movements. "I don't show more skin than is proper, if that's what you mean. But if you're expecting me to be silent and submissive, to defer to your judgment in all things, and pretend I have no thoughts of my own, well, I believe in truth in advertising, Mr. Turner. That's not who I am." Jacob stood frozen for a moment, processing this declaration. He'd sent for a wife to make his life easier, more comfortable. Someone who would fit into the life he'd already built like a missing piece in a puzzle. But Eleanor Hayes was beginning to look less like a missing piece and more like a whole different puzzle altogether. "Then who are you?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. Eleanor paused at the door of the store, turning back to look at him with those remarkable eyes. "I suppose we'll both find out, won't we?" The hotel was Sweetwater's finest establishment, which meant it had clean sheets and only a moderate amount of dust in the corners. Jacob had reserved Eleanor a room on the second floor, away from the noise of the saloon next door. He carried her trunks up himself, refusing the help of the aging bellhop, partly out of pride and partly because he needed the physical activity to calm his racing thoughts. Eleanor's room was small but neat, with a brass bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking Main Street. She moved around the space, testing the mattress, checking the water pitcher, examining the view with that same analytical gaze she'd turned on everything else. "This will do nicely for tonight," she announced. "What time should I be ready tomorrow?" "The ceremony is at 10, Jacob replied, suddenly feeling awkward in the small space. "I'll come for you at 9:30. "I'll be ready." Eleanor began unbuttoning her traveling coat, then paused. "Mr. Turner, Jacob, may I ask you something?" He nodded, hat in his hands again like a shield. "Why did you really send for a wife? The truth, not what you wrote in your letters." The question caught him off guard. He'd expected queries about the ranch, the house, maybe his financial situation, not this direct probe into his motivations. "I was lonely," he admitted after a long pause. "The ranch is successful, but it's empty. I wanted someone to share it with." "But someone quiet," Eleanor added, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Someone who wouldn't disturb your routine." "Yes," Jacob said, seeing no point in lying. Eleanor nodded slowly as if she'd expected this answer. "And if I'm not quiet, if I do disturb your routine," Jacob met her gaze directly for the first time since they'd left the train station. "Then I suppose my routine needed disturbing." Something shifted in Eleanor's expression, surprise perhaps, or approval. "That's the first interesting thing you've said since we met, Mr. Turner." Perhaps there's hope for us yet." As Jacob left the hotel, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just passed some kind of test, but whether he'd passed or failed, and what the consequences might be, remained to be seen. The saloon was busy when Jacob entered, seeking the familiar comfort of whiskey and masculine company. He found Tom Mackenzie at the bar, already 3 drinks in and eager to hear about the bride from Boston. "So," Tom asked, sliding a glass toward Jacob, "is she everything you hoped for?" Jacob took a long swallow of whiskey before answering. "She's nothing like what I expected." "Ugly?" Tom asked sympathetically. "No, she's—" Jacob struggled to find the words. "She's beautiful, but not in a delicate way. She's smart. She brought books and medical supplies and tools. She rides horses. She laughed at Morrison when he said she couldn't grow vegetables here." Tom whistled low. "Sounds like you got yourself a Spitfire Turner." "I asked for quiet," Jacob said miserably. "I specifically requested quiet. And instead you got interesting." Tom laughed, slapping Jacob on the back. "Count yourself lucky, friend. My Sarah may have run back to Philadelphia, but at least your bride seems inclined to stay and fight." "Fight what?" Jacob asked. "Everything." Tom grinned. "The land, the weather, the gossips, maybe even you. That woman sounds like she's ready to take on all of Texas." As Jacob nursed his whiskey, he thought about Eleanor's green eyes, the way she'd carried herself like a queen despite the dust and the stares. He'd wanted a wife who would make his life easier. Instead, he was beginning to suspect he'd gotten one who would make it infinitely more complicated. The question was, would that turn out to be a blessing or a curse? That night, Jacob lay in his room at the boarding house he stayed at when in town, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine Eleanor in his home. Would she hate the isolation? Would the harsh reality of ranch life send her running back to Boston like Tom's Sarah? Or would she prove to be something else entirely? Something he hadn't even known he was looking for. Sleep, when it finally came, was filled with dreams of green eyes and the sound of laughter that echoed across the prairie like thunder. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with a cool breeze that promised the coming winter. Jacob dressed in his best suit, the one he'd worn to his father's funeral, and hadn't touched since. It still fit mostly, though. The years of ranch work had broadened his shoulders, and the vest was a bit snug. He arrived at the hotel at 9:30 sharp, expecting to have to wait while Eleanor completed whatever mysterious preparations women required for such occasions. Instead, he found her already in the lobby, dressed in a simple but elegant dress of dove-gray silk with pearl buttons down the front. Her hair was pinned up in an elaborate style that somehow managed to be both proper and flattering, with a few strategic curls framing her face. "Good morning, Jacob," she said, rising from her chair with fluid grace. "You look very handsome." Jacob felt his face flush. "Look, you're beautiful." And she was, but not in the way he'd expected a bride to be beautiful. There was no blushing delicacy, no trembling nervousness. Eleanor looked like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and why she was doing it. She looked like a force to be reckoned with. "Shall we?" Eleanor took his offered arm, and they walked out into the morning sunshine together. The church was only a few blocks away, a simple white building with a modest steeple that served the spiritual needs of Sweetwater's diverse population. Reverend Morrison, a thin man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, greeted them at the door. "Mr. Turner, Miss Hayes, are you ready for this blessed union?" "As ready as anyone can be for marriage to a stranger," Eleanor said pleasantly, causing the Reverend to blink in surprise. Jacob tensed, but Eleanor squeezed his arm gently. "I believe in honesty, Reverend. Mr. Turner and I are entering this marriage as a practical arrangement, but I also believe that honesty is a better foundation for a union than false romance, don't you?" The Reverend cleared his throat. Yes, I suppose that's true. Shall we proceed?" The ceremony was witnessed by Tom Mackenzie, who'd cleaned himself up admirably for the occasion, and Mrs. Morrison, the Reverend's wife, who played the organ with more enthusiasm than skill. As they stood before the altar, Jacob found himself stealing glances at Eleanor's profile, trying to read the thoughts behind her composed expression. When it came time for the vows, Eleanor spoke them clearly and firmly, her voice carrying to the back of the small church. I, Eleanor Hayes, take you, Jacob Turner, to be my husband, to have and to hold for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do us part. Love and cherish. The words hung in the air between them, a promise and a challenge. Could they learn to love each other? Could a marriage built on loneliness and letters become something real? Jacob repeated his own vows, surprised by how much he meant them. This stranger in gray silk was now his wife, for better or worse, and he was beginning to suspect it would be both. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Morrison intoned. You may kiss your bride. Jacob leaned in carefully, intending a brief, chaste kiss appropriate for their practical arrangement, but Eleanor met him halfway, her lips soft but sure against his, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them standing in a shaft of sunlight that streamed through the church's simple windows. When they parted, Eleanor's cheeks were slightly flushed, the first sign of vulnerability he'd seen from her. It made her somehow more real, more human, and paradoxically more intimidating. Well, she said quietly for his ears alone, that was unexpected. Jacob couldn't have agreed more. After signing the necessary papers and accepting congratulations from the Morrisons and Tom, they loaded Eleanor's trunks onto the wagon for the journey to the ranch. The town was fully awake now, and Jacob was acutely aware of the eyes following them as they made their way down Main Street. Mrs. Pritchard and her circle had positioned themselves strategically outside the mercantile, pretending to examine bolts of fabric while obviously watching the newlyweds. "Should we stop and say hello?" Eleanor asked, noting the direction of his gaze. "God, no," Jacob said quickly, then caught himself. "I mean, if you'd like to—" "I was joking, Jacob." Eleanor's lips twitched with suppressed amusement. "I have no desire to be examined like a prize heifer. There will be time enough for that later." As they left the town behind, the landscape opened up before them, endless grassland punctuated by mesquite trees and the occasional rocky outcropping. The sky stretched from horizon to horizon, a dome of brilliant blue that made the world seem both infinite and intimate. Eleanor had been quiet for the first few minutes of the journey, but as they moved deeper into the wild country, she began to ask questions. "How large is your ranch yet?" 2,000 acres, give or take, small compared to some of the big operations, but it's good land with reliable water. Water? Her interest sharpened. From where? There's a creek that runs through the eastern section fed by an underground spring. It's never run dry, not even in the worst droughts. And you run cattle, about 300 head at the moment. I'm looking to expand next year if the prices hold. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully, her eyes scanning the landscape with that analytical gaze he was beginning to recognize. What about horses? I keep a small remuda, about 20 horses, some for working cattle, some for breeding. I'd like to see them, Eleanor said. I had to leave my mare behind in Boston. She wouldn't have survived the journey, but I'm hoping to find a suitable mount here. You're serious about riding? Jacob said, not quite a question. Very serious. Eleanor turned to look at him directly. Does that bother you? Jacob considered the question. His mother had never ridden. She'd considered it unladylike. The few ranch wives he knew either rode out of necessity, perched uncomfortably on gentle mares, or not at all. I suppose that depends on how you ride, he said finally. Eleanor's smile was slow and slightly wicked. I ride astride Mr. Turner. I know it's scandalous, but side saddle is impractical and dangerous in rough country. If that's going to be a problem, you should tell me now. Astride. Like a man. The image that formed in Jacob's mind was indeed scandalous and oddly thrilling. My ranch, my rules, he said after a moment. If you want to ride astride, that's your business. Our ranch, Eleanor corrected gently. I'm your wife now, remember? What's yours is mine, legally speaking. The reminder hit Jacob like cold water. She was right, of course. In marrying her, he'd given her claim to everything he'd built. The thought should have terrified him, but instead he found himself curious about what she would do with that claim. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clop of hooves creating a rhythmic soundtrack to their journey. Jacob found himself stealing glances at Eleanor, noting the way she held herself on the hard wagon seat, the way her eyes tracked the flight of a hawk overhead, the way her hands rested calmly in her lap despite the bumpy ride. "There," Jacob said, finally pointing ahead. "That's the Double J." The ranch house sat on a slight rise, commanding a view of the surrounding grassland. It was a solid two-story structure of limestone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. To the left stood the barn and corral. To the right, the bunkhouse where his two ranch hands lived. It wasn't fancy, but it was well-built and well-maintained, a testament to years of hard work and careful planning. Eleanor studied it all with that intense gaze, taking in every detail. "It's wonderful," she said finally, and Jacob could tell she meant it. "You built this yourself." "Most of it. Had help with the barn raising, but the house is mine." "Ours," Eleanor corrected again, but this time there was warmth in her voice. "Tell me about the hands." "Sam and Miguel. Sam's been with me 3 years. He's young but reliable. Miguel is older, knows more about cattle than any man I've met. They're good men." "Do they know about me?" "They know I was bringing home a wife. Don't imagine they expected—" Jacob trailed off, gesturing vaguely at Eleanor. "Expected someone like me?" Eleanor finished, amused. "No, I imagine they didn't." As they pulled up to the house, both Sam and Miguel emerged from the barn, hats in hand. Sam was indeed young, perhaps 22, with sandy hair and an open, friendly face. Miguel was in his 40s, weathered and lean, with sharp, dark eyes that missed nothing. "Boys, this is Mrs. Turner," Jacob said as he helped Eleanor down from the wagon. "Eleanor, this is Sam Holloway, and Miguel Vasquez." "Ma'am," both men said in unison, though Jacob caught the flash of surprise in their eyes as they took in Eleanor's confident bearing and direct gaze. "Gentlemen," Eleanor replied warmly, "I look forward to getting to know you both. I hope you'll be patient with me as I learn the ways of the ranch." "Happy to help however we can, ma'am," Sam said eagerly, already charmed. Miguel's response was more measured, his eyes moving between Eleanor and Jacob with obvious curiosity. "Welcome to the Double J, Señora." As the men unloaded Eleanor's trunks, she stood on the porch surveying her new domain. Jacob watched her, trying to see it through her eyes, the vast emptiness that could be either freedom or prison, the harsh beauty that could either seduce or repel. "Show me everything," Eleanor said, suddenly turning to him with bright eyes. "The house, the barn, the horses. I want to see it all." "Don't you want to rest?" "Change. It's been a long morning." "Jacob," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I've been sitting on trains for 5 days. The last thing I want is to rest. Show me our home." "Our home." The words sent an unexpected warmth through Jacob's chest. He offered her his arm, and together they walked through the front door of the house that would either unite them or divide them, only time would tell which. The interior of the house reflected Jacob's practical nature. The front door opened into a parlor with simple but sturdy furniture, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out over the prairie. To the right was the dining room with a table Jacob had made himself, and beyond that the kitchen with a large cast-iron stove and a pantry stocked with basic supplies. Eleanor moved through each room, slowly running her fingers over surfaces, testing the sturdiness of chairs, examining the construction of shelves and cabinets. In the kitchen, she inspected the stove with particular interest, opening the firebox, checking the dampers, nodding approval at its condition. "You take good care of your equipment," she observed. "Have to out here. Can't just run to town when something breaks." "No, I suppose not." Eleanor moved to the window over the sink, which looked out toward the creek. "Is that water source you mentioned?" "Yes. The creek runs about a quarter-mile from the house. I've been thinking about digging an irrigation channel, bringing water closer for a kitchen garden." Eleanor turned to him with such delight that it transformed her face. "You have—" "Well, it was just a thought. Might be too much work for what it's worth. Nothing that provides food security is too much work," Eleanor said firmly. "I'd very much like to help with that project if you'll let me." The idea of his Boston-bred wife digging irrigation ditches should have been absurd. Instead, Jacob found himself nodding. "We'll look at it together, figure out the best route." Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, the large main bedroom that Jacob used, and 2 smaller rooms that sat empty. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the main bedroom, taking in the massive bed Jacob had built to accommodate his tall frame, the simple dresser, the trunk at the foot of the bed. I suppose this is our room now, she said, and for the first time since stepping off the train, she sounded uncertain. Jacob cleared his throat. I thought, that is if you'd prefer one of the other rooms could be yours, until you're comfortable. Eleanor turned to look at him, something soft in her expression. That's very considerate of you, Jacob. Perhaps that would be best, at least for now. Relief and disappointment warred in Jacob's chest, but he simply nodded. The room on the left gets the best morning light. They moved Eleanor's personal trunk into the smaller bedroom, which, despite its size, was pleasant enough with a window that looked out toward the barn and corral. Eleanor immediately began unpacking, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe, arranging her brushes and personal items on the dresser with efficient movements. Now, she said, closing the trunk with a decisive click, show me the horses. The barn was Jacob's pride, solidly built and well organized with stalls for 12 horses, a tack room, and a large loft for hay storage. Several horses were in their stalls, heads turning curiously as Jacob and Eleanor entered. This is Dusty, Jacob said, stopping at the first stall where a gray gelding stood. He's my primary cow horse, smart as a whip and steady as they come. Eleanor extended her hand slowly, letting Dusty sniff her fingers before stroking his neck. Hello, handsome, she murmured, and the horse leaned into her touch. They moved down the line, Jacob introducing each horse, surprised by Eleanor's knowledge and the easy way she handled each animal. When they reached the last occupied stall, Jacob hesitated. This is Tempest, he said carefully. She's difficult. The mare in question was a beautiful bay with a white blaze down her face, but she stood at the back of her stall, ears pinned, eyeing them with clear suspicion. Difficult how? Eleanor asked, not approaching the stall, but observing the mare with interest. She was mistreated by her previous owner. I bought her at auction thinking I could gentle her, but she won't let anyone near her. Bites, kicks, the works. I've been thinking about selling her. Don't. The word came out sharp and immediate. Eleanor softened her tone. That is, please don't. Not yet. Give me some time with her. Eleanor, she's dangerous. All damaged creatures are dangerous, Eleanor said quietly, still watching the mare. That doesn't mean they're beyond redemption. Something in her tone made Jacob wonder if they were still talking about the horse. That evening, after a simple supper that Eleanor insisted on helping prepare, despite Jacob's protest that she should rest, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie. The sky was a masterpiece of orange and pink and purple, the kind of sunset that made even hardened cowboys pause in appreciation. It's beautiful, Eleanor said softly. Different from Boston sunsets, but beautiful. Do you miss it, Boston? Eleanor considered the question. I miss certain things. The libraries, the concerts, the energy of the city, but I don't miss the constraints. Constraints. You have no idea what it's like for a woman in Boston society, Jacob. Every move watched, every word weighed, every action judged against an impossible standard of propriety. Here, she gestured at the vast open space before them. Here, I can breathe. That why you answered my advertisement? Partly. Eleanor turned to look at him. May I be completely honest with you? I'd prefer it. I answered your advertisement because I was running out of options. I'm 26, well past the ideal marrying age. My parents died 2 years ago, leaving me with enough money to survive, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle I was raised in. I could have become a governess or a teacher, but that would have meant a life of servitude to other people's children. Or I could have married Harold Worthington, who, a business associate of my father's, 48 years old with breath that could fell a horse and hands that wandered when he'd had too much brandy, which was often. Jacob felt an unexpected surge of anger at this unknown man. He proposed several times, and each time the financial pressure grew stronger. My aunt, with whom I was living, made it clear that I was becoming a burden. So when I saw your advertisement, a rancher in Texas seeking a modest, quiet wife, I thought, well, at least in Texas I'll have room to run if needed. And you lied about being quiet and modest, Eleanor laughed. I didn't lie exactly. I can be quiet when necessary, and I dress modestly. I just perhaps allowed you to draw your own conclusions about what those words meant. Despite himself, Jacob found himself smiling. That's a very creative interpretation of honesty. I prefer to think of it as selective truth-telling. Eleanor's expression grew serious. But I promise you this, Jacob, from this day forward, I will be completely honest with you. You deserve that much. And what makes you think I'll be able to handle your honesty? Eleanor studied him in the fading light. Because you haven't sent me back yet. Despite the books and the tools and the riding astride and everything else that I'm sure wasn't what you were expecting. No, Jacob admitted. You're nothing like what I was expecting. Are you disappointed? Jacob thought about the question. Really thought about it. He'd wanted quiet, predictable, easy. Eleanor was none of those things. But watching her with the horses, seeing her enthusiasm about the irrigation project, feeling the way she'd kissed him at the altar, not like a stranger, but like a promise. No, he said finally. I'm not disappointed. Confused, maybe. A little terrified, but not disappointed. Eleanor's smile was radiant in the twilight. Good, because I have plans for this place, Jacob Turner. Plans that are definitely going to disturb your routine. As if to emphasize her point, a coyote howled in the distance, its cry echoing across the darkening prairie. It was a wild sound, untamed and free, and Jacob couldn't help but think it was oddly appropriate. He'd sent for a quiet wife. He'd gotten Eleanor instead. And may God help them both. The weeks that followed Eleanor's arrival at the Double J Ranch unfolded like a slow-burning fuse, each day bringing new revelations that shattered Jacob's carefully ordered world. That first morning after their wedding, he'd woken before dawn as usual, dressed quietly and made his way downstairs expecting to start the coffee and eat a cold biscuit before heading out to check the cattle. Instead, he found Eleanor already in the kitchen, fully dressed in a practical cotton dress with her hair pinned up, bacon sizzling in a pan while she kneaded bread dough with practiced efficiency. "Good morning," she said without turning around. "Coffee's ready. I hope you like it strong." Jacob poured himself a cup, noting that she'd somehow figured out his preference without asking. The coffee was indeed strong and better than anything he'd managed to brew himself. "How long have you been up?" "About an hour. I've always been an early riser, and there's something about the quality of light just before dawn that I find irresistible." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "I hope you don't mind that I've taken over your kitchen." "It's your kitchen now, too," Jacob reminded her, settling into his usual chair at the table. The domesticity of the scene should have been exactly what he'd wanted when he'd sent for a wife. But there was something about Eleanor's presence that charged the air with electricity, making even this simple morning ritual feel dangerous somehow. "Sam and Miguel will be expecting breakfast too, won't they?" Eleanor asked, flipping the bacon with expert precision. "I've made enough for everyone. They usually fend for themselves in the bunkhouse, but I'm sure they'd appreciate a proper meal." Eleanor nodded decisively. "Then that's settled. From now on, they'll take breakfast here. A ranch runs better when the hands are well fed." It wasn't a question or a request, and Jacob found himself both irritated and impressed by her assumption of authority. But when Sam and Miguel arrived for their morning assignments, and Eleanor presented them with plates piled high with bacon, eggs, fresh bread, and preserves she'd somehow conjured from the pantry's meager supplies, their expressions of grateful amazement made Jacob hold his tongue. "Ma'am, this is—" Sam paused, apparently overcome by the sight of actual butter melting on warm bread. "This is the finest breakfast I've had since I left home." Miguel said nothing, but the speed with which he demolished his portion spoke volumes. When Eleanor refilled his coffee cup, without being asked, the older man's weathered face softened almost imperceptibly. "Now then," Eleanor said, taking her own seat at the table with considerably less food on her plate. "Tell me about today's plans." Jacob exchanged glances with his hands. Ranch business had always been discussed among the men, decisions made without consultation. But Eleanor's expectant gaze brooked no argument. "We're moving the herd from the south pasture to the eastern section closer to the creek," Jacob explained. "The grass is getting thin where they are now." "How many head?" Eleanor asked, spreading jam on her bread with delicate precision. "About 150. The rest are already at the creek." "And you'll need all three of you for that." "It's rough country between here and there." Miguel spoke up, his accent thick, but his English clear. "Many places for cattle to scatter." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Then I'll come too. An extra pair of hands couldn't hurt." The silence that followed was deafening. Sam's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. Miguel's eyes darted between Jacob and Eleanor like a man watching a fuse burn toward dynamite. Jacob himself felt his jaw working but no words coming out. "I can ride," Eleanor continued calmly as if she hadn't just proposed something scandalous. "And I can follow directions. Surely 4 people can move cattle more efficiently than 3. "Mrs. Turner," Jacob began carefully, "moving cattle isn't like riding in a park. It's dangerous work. The longhorns can be unpredictable, and if something spooks them, then I'll learn to handle it," Eleanor interrupted. "How else am I supposed to understand the ranch operations by sitting in the house darning socks while you menfolk do all the real work?" There was a challenge in her voice that made Jacob's spine straighten. Part of him wanted to forbid it outright to establish his authority as husband and ranch owner. But another part, a part that was growing stronger each day, was curious to see what Eleanor Turner was truly capable of. "She could ride drag," Miguel suggested quietly, earning surprised looks from everyone at the table. "Away from the main herd. Safe enough if she stays back." Jacob considered this. Riding drag meant eating dust all day, the worst position in any cattle drive. It was usually reserved for the newest, least experienced hand. If Eleanor wanted to prove herself, this would certainly be a test. "Fine," he said finally. "But you'll wear proper clothing, no side saddle, no fancy riding habits. And if I tell you to get clear, you don't question, you just ride. Understood?" Eleanor's smile was brilliant. "Perfectly understood." An hour later, Jacob stood in the barn watching Eleanor emerge from the house in an outfit that made his mouth go dry. She'd somehow procured a pair of men's trousers that had been altered to fit her frame, worn with a simple cotton shirt tucked in and secured with a leather belt. Her hair was braided and pinned close to her head, covered with a wide-brimmed hat she must have found in one of her trunks. She looked scandalous. She looked practical. She looked like trouble incarnate. "Will this do?" she asked, spreading her arms for inspection. Sam made a strangled noise that might have been agreement. Miguel suddenly found the bridle in his hands fascinating. Jacob forced himself to nod curtly. "You'll ride Belle," he said, leading her to a stall containing a calm mare. "She's steady and knows the work." Eleanor approached the horse with the same confident ease she'd shown the day before, introducing herself with soft words and gentle touches, before efficiently saddling the mare with movements that spoke of long practice. When she swung up into the saddle astride, as promised, Jacob had to look away from the sight of her trouser-clad legs gripping the horse's sides. The ride to the south pasture was accomplished mostly in silence, Eleanor falling back naturally to ride beside Miguel, while Jacob and Sam took the lead. Jacob found himself constantly checking over his shoulder, expecting to see her struggling with the unfamiliar terrain or the increasingly warm morning sun. Instead, he saw her deep in conversation with Miguel, the taciturn vaquero, apparently telling her about the different grasses they passed and which ones the cattle preferred. When they reached the herd spread out across a valley between 2 low hills, Jacob pulled up to assess the situation. The cattle were calm, grazing peacefully, but he knew how quickly that could change. "Sam, you take the left flank, Miguel the right. I'll ride point." He turned to Eleanor. "You stay behind them all. Keep the stragglers moving, but don't crowd them. If anything goes wrong—" "I get clear," Eleanor finished. "I understand Jacob." The first part of the drive went smoothly. The cattle, familiar with the routine, began moving toward the creek with only minimal encouragement. Eleanor held her position at the rear, occasionally calling out to a wandering steer in a voice that carried surprising authority. Jacob began to relax, thinking perhaps this wouldn't be the disaster he'd feared. Then a rattlesnake hidden in the grass until the last moment spooked Sam's horse. The animal reared with a shriek of terror, sending Sam tumbling to the ground. The cattle, already nervous from the horse's distress, began to mill anxiously. Jacob saw the disaster unfolding in slow motion, Sam on the ground, his horse bolting the herd beginning to turn back on itself, and Eleanor directly in their path if they decided to run. "Eleanor, get out of there!" he shouted, spurring Dusty toward the increasingly agitated herd. But Eleanor was already moving not away from danger, but toward Sam. She leaned low over Belle's neck, riding at full gallop toward the fallen cowboy. In one fluid motion that Jacob would replay in his mind for days afterward, she reached down, grabbed Sam's outstretched arm, and hauled him up behind her on Belle's back. the mare never breaking stride as Eleanor guided her out of the path of the now running cattle. The stampede was brief. Miguel and Jacob managed to turn the leaders before they built up too much momentum, circling them back until the herd settled. But those few minutes felt like hours, especially when Jacob finally spotted Eleanor and Sam safe on a small rise, both of them dusty but unharmed. "You could have been killed," Jacob said when he reached them, his voice rough with fear disguised as anger. "I told you to get clear." "Sam would have been trampled," Eleanor replied calmly, though Jacob noticed her hands were trembling slightly as she helped Sam slide down from Belle's back. "I made a judgment call." That was incredible, ma'am," Sam gasped, his face pale beneath the dust. "You saved my life." "You would have done the same for me," Eleanor said simply, then turned to Jacob with those green eyes that seemed to see right through him. "Wouldn't you?" Jacob couldn't answer because the truth was too complicated. Yes, he would have tried to save Sam, but he wasn't sure he could have executed the rescue with Eleanor's swift precision, and the fear he'd felt seeing her ride toward danger rather than away from it had been unlike anything he'd experienced before, sharp and personal in a way that disturbed him. Miguel appeared leading Sam's recovered horse. "The herd is calm, Jefe. We can continue when ready." He looked at Eleanor with something that might have been approval. "The Señora rides well." "Thank you, Miguel," Eleanor said, remounting Belle with easy grace despite what had just happened. "Shall we continue? We're losing the good light." The rest of the drive passed without incident. Though Jacob couldn't shake the image of Eleanor racing toward danger, her braid flying behind her like a battle flag. When they finally got the herd settled by the creek, the sun was high and hot, and everyone was covered in a fine layer of dust. "Well," Eleanor said, dismounting and beating dust from her hat, "that was educational." Sam laughed, still somewhat shaky from his near miss. "That's one way to put it, ma'am." "You did good," Miguel said quietly, the most words anyone had heard him string together about anyone other than cattle. "Natural instinct." Eleanor's smile was pleased, but not prideful. "I had good teachers," she said, including all three men in her gaze. "Now who's hungry? I packed sandwiches in my saddlebags." As they sat in the shade of a mesquite tree, eating Eleanor's surprisingly delicious sandwiches and drinking from canteens, Jacob watched his wife interact with his ranch hands. She drew Sam out about his family back in Missouri, got Miguel talking about his years working cattle from Mexico to Montana, and somehow made them all feel like they were part of something more than just another ranch crew. This wasn't what he'd wanted, Jacob thought. He'd wanted a wife who would keep his house and warm his bed and leave the ranch work to him. Instead, he'd gotten Eleanor, who rode toward danger, wore trousers, and was currently explaining to Sam her theory about using different grass rotation patterns to improve pasture yield. The disturbing thing was he was beginning to think he'd gotten something better than what he'd wanted. That evening, as Eleanor helped serve supper to the exhausted but satisfied crew, Jacob noticed Mrs. Pritchard's buggy approaching the house. His stomach sank. The leader of Sweetwater's social circle hadn't wasted much time in coming to inspect his new bride. "We have company," he warned Eleanor, who was just setting a pot of stew on the table. Eleanor glanced out the window, took in the approaching buggy with its well-dressed occupant, and calmly removed her apron. "I suppose it was too much to hope they'd give us more than 2 days," she said dryly. "Sam, Miguel, you'd better take your supper to the bunkhouse. This won't be pleasant for anyone." The hands grabbed their bowls and fled with obvious relief, leaving Jacob and Eleanor to face the incoming storm alone. Mrs. Pritchard was a formidable woman in her 50s, with iron gray hair styled in an elaborate coiffure and a dress that probably cost more than most cowboys made in a year. She swept into the house without waiting for an invitation, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the modest interior. "Mr. Turner," she said coolly, then turned her gaze on Eleanor. "And you must be the new Mrs. Turner. How interesting." Eleanor's smile was polite but guarded. "Mrs. Pritchard, I presume. How kind of you to call." "Yes, well, one must welcome new members of our community." Mrs. Pritchard settled herself in the best chair without being asked. "Though I must say the reports of your arrival have been quite colorful." "Oh." Eleanor seated herself with perfect posture that would have done credit to any Boston drawing room. "How unfortunate. I do hope the colors were flattering." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes narrowed slightly. I heard you were seen in town wearing trousers. Riding skirts are impractical for ranch work, Eleanor replied evenly. Surely you understand the necessity of appropriate attire for different tasks. Ranch work? Mrs. Pritchard's voice rose slightly. Surely you don't mean to say you actually participate in cattle driving, among other things. Would you care for some tea? I'm afraid I haven't had time to bake anything fresh, what with helping move the herd today. The older woman's face was a study in horrified fascination. You helped with the cattle. Someone had to ride drag, Eleanor said mildly. More hands make lighter work, as they say. My dear girl, Mrs. Pritchard began in a tone that suggested Eleanor was anything but dear to her. You must understand that there are certain standards of behavior expected of a rancher's wife in this community. What might have been acceptable in, where did you say you were from? Boston. Boston. Mrs. Pritchard said it like one might say Sodom or Gomorrah. Well, what might be acceptable in Boston is quite different from what we expect here. A lady does not wear men's clothing. A lady does not work with cattle. A lady certainly does not ride astride like some common… Well, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Eleanor's pleasant expression never changed, but Jacob saw steel creep into her spine. How fascinating, Eleanor said softly. And tell me, Mrs. Pritchard, what does a lady do here? Besides pass judgment on women she's known for all of 5 minutes. Mrs. Pritchard's face flushed red. I beg your pardon. Oh, I do apologize. Was that not ladylike? I'm still learning the local customs. Eleanor's smile was sharp as a blade. Perhaps you could enlighten me. Does a lady here pretend her husband's ranch runs itself? Does she sit in her parlor doing needlepoint while her husband and his hands work themselves to exhaustion? Does she prioritize the opinions of gossiping townswomen over the success of her family's livelihood? Eleanor, Jacob said quietly, a warning in his voice, though he wasn't sure if he was warning her to stop or encouraging her to continue. No, Jacob, I think Mrs. Pritchard came here to educate me, and I'm always eager to learn. Eleanor turned back to the older woman who looked like she'd swallowed a wasp. Please do go on. Tell me more about what a lady does and doesn't do. I'm particularly interested in whether a lady saves a man from being trampled by cattle or if she should let him die to preserve her reputation. You… What? Mrs. Pritchard sputtered. Oh, didn't you hear? There was a small stampede today. Sam nearly got himself killed when his horse spooked. But don't worry, I maintained perfect posture while pulling him to safety. I'm sure that's what really matters. The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Pritchard stood slowly, her face now pale except for 2 spots of high color on her cheeks. I can see, she said icily, that you are determined to flout every convention of decent society. Don't expect to be welcomed into the better homes of Sweetwater, Mrs. Turner, and don't expect your husband's business relationships to remain unaffected by your behavior. Is that a threat? Eleanor asked pleasantly. It's a prediction, Mrs. Pritchard replied. Good day, Mr. Turner. I hope you know what you've brought into our community. After she left, the silence in the house was thick enough to cut. Eleanor stood at the window, watching the buggy disappear into the distance, her shoulders tense. I'm sorry, she said finally. I shouldn't have antagonized her. You were right about me disturbing your routine. I'm disturbing your entire life. Jacob moved to stand beside her close enough to smell the mixture of soap and sunshine that clung to her hair. You saved Sam's life today. That's not… And you're right. A ranch wife who actually helps run the ranch is more valuable than one who sits around worrying about what the neighbors think. Eleanor turned to look at him, surprise evident in her features. You're not angry. Oh, I'm furious, Jacob said, but he was smiling. Mrs. Pritchard is going to make our lives difficult. She has influence in town, and that influence affects business. But he paused, searching for the right words. But I think maybe my life needed some difficulty. It was getting too predictable. Predictable, Eleanor repeated, a smile tugging at her lips. Is that what you call it? Boring, maybe, Jacob admitted. Safe. Comfortable. And now, Now I'm married to a woman who wears trousers, saves cowboys from stampedes, and tells the town's leading lady to go to hell without actually saying the words. Eleanor laughed that rich, genuine sound that Jacob was beginning to crave. I was rather proud of that last part. You should be. I've wanted to tell that woman off for years, but never had the courage. Courage? Eleanor shook her head. It's not courage, Jacob. It's just, I've already lost everything once. My parents, my home, my entire world. What's the worst Mrs. Pritchard can do? Make people whisper about me. They're already doing that. Refuse to invite me to tea. I'd rather work the ranch anyway. And if she turns the other ranchers against us, makes it hard to do business. Eleanor's chin lifted in that defiant gesture he was coming to recognize. Then we'll find other ways. We'll drive our cattle further to better markets. We'll make connections with people who care more about quality beef than the length of my skirts. We'll build something stronger than social approval. Jacob repeated, tasting the word. You keep saying we. Aren't we married? Eleanor asked, turning to face him fully. Isn't that what marriage means? Partnership. Jacob had never thought of marriage as partnership. His parents' marriage had been more like a business arrangement with clearly defined roles that never overlapped. His mother had ruled the house. His father had ruled everything else. But Eleanor was proposing something different, something that both thrilled and terrified him. I suppose it could mean that, he said carefully. Eleanor reached out and took his hand, her fingers small but strong in his grasp. Jacob, I know I'm not what you wanted. I know I'm difficult and unconventional and probably going to cause you no end of trouble. But I promise you this, I will work beside you every day to make this ranch successful. I will never give you cause to doubt my commitment to this marriage, even if it started as a practical arrangement. And I will never ever be boring. Jacob looked down at their joined hands, her pale skin stark against his sun-darkened fingers. Such a simple touch, yet it sent warmth spreading through his chest like whiskey on a cold night. You know what the funny thing is, he said quietly. I sent for a wife because I was lonely. I thought having someone in the house would fix that, but I realize now I could have had a dozen quiet, modest wives and still been lonely. Because I wasn't just alone, Eleanor. I was isolated, cut off from any real connection. And now, she prompted softly, now I have a wife who insists my ranch hands eat breakfast with us, who asks Miguel about grass types and makes Sam talk about his family, who rides into danger to save someone she barely knows, who stands up to the town bully on principle. He squeezed her hand gently. I might still be alone sometimes, but I don't think I'll be isolated anymore. Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears. You're going to make me cry, and I haven't cried since my parents' funeral. God forbid, Jacob said with mock horror. What would Mrs. Pritchard say? That broke the tension, and Eleanor laughed, leaning into him slightly. It was the first time they'd been this close since their kiss at the altar, and Jacob was acutely aware of every point of contact between them. She'd probably say a lady doesn't cry in front of her husband either, Eleanor said. Apparently ladies don't do much of anything useful. Then thank God I didn't marry a lady. Eleanor looked up at him, something shifting in her expression. What did you marry Jacob Turner? He thought about this woman who'd blown into his life like a force of nature, disrupting everything he'd thought he wanted. I think I married a partner, Misa, he said finally. God help me. That night, as they cleaned up from supper working side by side in comfortable domesticity, Jacob found himself thinking about the future differently. He'd always planned in terms of survival, get through the next season, the next drive, the next year. But watching Eleanor efficiently wash dishes while describing her ideas for expanding the vegetable garden, he began to think in terms of building something larger than mere survival. We should think about improving the breeding program, Eleanor was saying. Those horses you bought last year have good bloodlines, but if we're strategic about it, we could develop a reputation for quality remounts. The Army's always looking for good horses. That would take years to establish, Jacob pointed out, drying a plate. Good thing we have years then, Eleanor replied easily, then seemed to realize what she'd said. That is, I assume we have years, Jacob confirmed quietly. This marriage might have started as a practical arrangement, Eleanor, but I'm beginning to think it might become something more. She turned to look at him, suds still clinging to her hands. Something more, something real, he said simply. The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of possibility. Then Eleanor smiled soft and genuine without any of her usual sharp edges. I'd like that, she said simply. Later, as Jacob lay in his bed listening to Eleanor moving around in her own room just down the hall, he thought about the twists of fate that had brought them together. He'd wanted quiet and gotten fire. He'd wanted simple and gotten complex. He'd wanted a wife and gotten, what? A partner, yes. A force of nature, certainly. But maybe, just maybe, something more precious than either of those things. He thought about her racing towards Sam, about her standing up to Mrs. Pritchard, about the way she'd held his hand and promised not to be boring. No, Eleanor Turner would never be boring. She would challenge him, push him, probably drive him half mad with her unconventional ways. But she would also stand beside him, work alongside him, and maybe if they were both brave enough, love him in a way that was as fierce and untamed as the land they were trying to build a life on. The next morning brought new challenges, as mornings on a ranch always did. One of the pregnant cows was showing signs of early labor. A section of fence had been knocked down by something in the night, and Miguel reported seeing signs of wolves near the eastern pasture. I'll help with the fence, Eleanor announced over breakfast, already dressed in her scandalous trousers. The cow needs watching, Jacob countered. If she's in trouble, we might need to help with the delivery. Then I'll watch her. I've helped deliver calves before. All three men turned to stare at her. When? Jacob asked, incredulous. There was a farm outside Boston where I used to ride. The owner's daughter was a friend, and I spent summers there as a girl. Mr. Henderson taught me about animal husbandry. He said I had good instincts. She took a sip of coffee, casual as you please. Besides, smaller hands can be useful if the calf is turned wrong. And so Jacob found himself leaving his Boston-bred wife in charge of a laboring cow while he and the hands went to repair fence. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that he should be protecting her from the harsh realities of ranch life, not throwing her into them. But Eleanor had already proven she could handle herself, and they needed all hands working if they were going to keep the ranch running smoothly. When he returned hours later, hot and tired from wrestling with fence posts, he found Eleanor in the barn kneeling in the straw beside a cow and her newly delivered calf. Her clothes were a mess. There was blood on her hands, and she'd never looked more beautiful. Both healthy, she announced, beaming. The calf was turned a bit, but we managed. Well, mostly her, Eleanor admitted, stroking the exhausted cow's flank. I just provided encouragement and the occasional redirect. Isn't the calf beautiful? The calf was actually rather ungainly, all legs and wet fur, but the pride in Eleanor's voice made Jacob's chest tight. Beautiful, he agreed, though he wasn't looking at the calf. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching another spectacular sunset, Eleanor suddenly said, "Tell me about your parents." Jacob tensed. It wasn't a subject he enjoyed discussing. Not much to tell. They died when I was 20. Fever took them both within a week of each other. I'm sorry. Eleanor's voice was soft. Were you close? My father and I worked together, but I wouldn't say we were close. He was a hard man focused on survival above all else. My mother, Jacob paused, searching for words. She was broken, I think. She'd come from a genteel family back east, married my father for love, and followed him to Texas. But the frontier broke her spirit. She spent her last years barely speaking, just going through the motions of life. That's why you wanted a quiet wife, Eleanor said, understanding dawning in her voice. You thought quiet meant content. Maybe, Jacob admitted. Or maybe I thought quiet meant less likely to be broken by this life. Eleanor reached over and took his hand, threading their fingers together. Your mother wasn't broken by the frontier, Jacob. She was broken by isolation, by not being allowed to truly participate in the life she'd chosen, by being expected to be an ornament in a place that has no use for ornaments. You think so? I know so. Women aren't fragile flowers, Jacob. We're just taught to pretend we are. Your mother might have thrived if she'd been allowed to truly be part of building something instead of just maintaining a household while life happened around her. Jacob thought about his mother, about the way she'd stood at the window looking out at the ranch work she wasn't allowed to join, about the gradual dimming of her eyes over the years. Maybe Eleanor was right. "Is that why you insist on being part of everything?" he asked. "Fear of being broken?" "No," Eleanor said firmly. "I insist on being part of everything because this is my life too. Our life, and I refuse to be a spectator in my own existence." The fierce determination in her voice made Jacob pull her closer until she was leaning against his shoulder. It was the most intimate they'd been since their wedding, and he could feel her pulse racing where her wrist pressed against his. "You know what you are," he said quietly. "You're like this land, beautiful and harsh and demanding and rewarding in equal measure. You can't be tamed or controlled, only partnered with." Eleanor turned her face up to his, and in the dying light her eyes were deep as forests. "Is that what you want to do, Jacob Turner, partner with me?" "I think it's too late for wanting," he admitted. "I think you've already made it impossible for me to imagine any other way." She smiled then, soft and pleased, and rose up on her toes to kiss his cheek. It was a simple gesture, almost chaste, but it sent fire racing through his veins. "Good night, Jacob," she whispered, and went inside, leaving him on the porch with the memory of her lips on his skin and the certainty that his life had irrevocably changed. Over the next weeks, they fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural. Eleanor rose early to make breakfast for everyone, then joined whatever work needed doing, whether that was helping with the cattle mending fence, working on her increasingly ambitious garden, or maintaining the house. She started teaching Sam to read better in the evenings, having discovered his embarrassment about his limited education. She learned Spanish phrases from Miguel, who slowly warmed to her presence until he was actually volunteering information about ranch operations without being asked. The town's reaction was less warming. True to her word, Mrs. Pritchard had spread the word about Eleanor's unnatural behavior, and several of the town's ladies made a point of snubbing her when she went to town for supplies. But Eleanor handled it with the same steel spine she brought to everything else, smiling pleasantly at their turned backs and going about her business. The crisis came 3 weeks after Eleanor's arrival, on a day that started like any other, but would end with blood and fire and the birth of a legend. Jacob had ridden out early with Miguel to check on the far pastures, leaving Sam and Eleanor to handle the routine chores closer to home. They were expected back by midday, but as the sun reached its zenith, Eleanor felt a prickle of unease. Something felt wrong, though she couldn't say what. She was in the garden trying to coax life from the stubborn Texas soil when she heard the horses. Not the familiar rhythm of Jacob and Miguel returning, but something else, multiple riders moving fast. Eleanor stood, shading her eyes against the sun. 5 men were approaching the ranch, and even from a distance she could tell they weren't friendly. Their postures were aggressive, predatory, and they were spreading out in a way that suggested they were surrounding the house. "Sam," she called, keeping her voice level despite the fear coursing through her. "We have company." Sam emerged from the barn, took one look at the approaching riders, and his face went pale. "That's the Morrison gang. They're wanted for rustling and worse. What are they doing here?" Eleanor's mind raced. Jacob and Miguel were too far away to help. It was just her and Sam against 5 dangerous men. Running wasn't an option, they'd be caught in the open. Fighting seemed impossible, but "Sam, get the rifles from the house. Load them all. Then get to the barn and stay hidden unless I call for you." "Ma'am, I can't leave you." "You can and you will," Eleanor said sharply. "Trust me, Sam. Go." As Sam ran for the house, Eleanor walked calmly to the porch, her mind calculating rapidly. She'd learned to shoot as a girl, another skill from those summers on the Henderson farm that she'd never mentioned to Jacob. But she'd never shot at a person before, never had to defend her life. Yet as the riders approached, she felt a strange calm settle over her. This was her home. These were her people to protect, and she'd be damned if she'd let these men take either. The riders pulled up just outside the yard, their leader a man with cold eyes and a scar across his jaw, dismounting with deliberate slowness. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, touching his hat mockingly. "We're looking for Jacob Turner." "He's not here," Eleanor replied, standing on the porch with her hands clasped calmly in front of her, though she could feel the rifle Sam had left just inside the door. "What's your business with my husband?" "Your husband?" The man's eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well, ain't that interesting? Turner finally got himself a woman. Pretty one, too. State your business or leave, Eleanor said coolly. My husband will be back soon, and he doesn't take kindly to trespassers. The man laughed an ugly sound. Oh, we're counting on him coming back. See, Turner's been a problem for us. Too honest, too successful. Makes it hard for us to do business in these parts. So we figured we'd pay him a visit, convince him to be more accommodating. And if he refuses, well, the man's hand moved to his gun, then we'll have to convince him another way, maybe through his pretty wife. Eleanor felt the threat like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step backward closer to the rifle. I should warn you, she said conversationally. I'm not from around here. Where I come from, we have different ways of handling unwelcome guests. That's so. The man took a step forward. And what ways would those be? Eleanor's hand found the rifle, and in one smooth motion, she brought it up, aimed, and fired. The shot took the man's hat clean off his head, sending it flying into the dirt. That's your warning, she said, already leveraging another round into the chamber. The next one won't miss. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the scarred man laughed, but it was nervous now. You've got spirit, woman, but there's 5 of us and 1 of you. Actually, Sam's voice came from the barn. There's 2 of us, and I don't miss either. Eleanor felt a surge of affection for the young cowboy, even as she kept her eyes on the gang. Here's what's going to happen, she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd learned in Boston, drawing rooms now sharpened to a killing edge. You're going to get on your horses and ride away. You're going to forget about Jacob Turner and his ranch. And if you ever come back, if you ever threaten my family again, I won't aim for your hat. The scarred man's face was red with rage, but he was also calculating. 2 rifles, good positions, and the woman had already proved she could shoot. It wasn't good odds. This ain't over, he snarled. Yes, Eleanor said simply. It is. For a long moment, the standoff continued. Then one of the other riders spoke up. Come on, Morrison. It ain't worth it. Morrison, so that was his name, spat in the dirt, then remounted his horse. You'll regret this, woman. The only thing I regret, Eleanor replied, is wasting a bullet on your hat. They rode away slowly, trying to salvage some dignity, but Eleanor didn't lower the rifle until they were completely out of sight. Only then did she allow herself to sag against the porch rail, her hands shaking. Sam ran from the barn, his face a mixture of awe and concern. Ma'am, are you all right? That was incredible, but that was necessary, Eleanor corrected, though she accepted his supportive arm gratefully. Sam, ride out and find Jacob and Miguel. Tell them what happened. They need to know the Morrison gang is in the area. But what about you? I'll be fine. I've got a rifle and a good vantage point. Go quickly. As Sam rode off, Eleanor returned to the house, placed the rifle within easy reach, and with hands that only trembled slightly, made herself a cup of tea. She'd just taken her first sip when she heard horses approaching again. Her hand went to the rifle, but then she recognized Dusty's familiar gait and Jacob's silhouette. He burst through the door like a man possessed, his face wild with fear. Eleanor, Sam told us, are you hurt? Did they… I'm fine, she said, setting down her tea carefully. They're gone. Jacob crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. She could feel his heart racing, could hear the ragged edge of his breathing. You could have been killed, he said roughly into her hair. When Sam told us the Morrison gang had been here, I thought God. Eleanor, I thought, but I wasn't, she said softly, her own arms coming up to hold him. I'm here. I'm safe. We're safe. He pulled back just enough to look at her face, his hands coming up to cup her cheeks. You stood off 5 outlaws with a rifle. 2 rifles, Eleanor corrected. Sam helped. Sam said you shot Morrison's hat off his head. It seemed like the clearest way to make my point. Jacob stared at her for a moment, then laughed a slightly hysterical sound. You are the most terrifying, magnificent woman I've ever met. Is that a compliment? It's a fact. His thumb stroked across her cheekbone. Eleanor, when I thought something might have happened to you… But nothing did, she interrupted gently. Jacob, this is the life we've chosen. There will be dangers, outlaws, storms, stampedes, who knows what else. But we'll face them together. Together. He repeated, then lowered his head and kissed her. The kiss was different from their wedding day. Desperate and fierce, born of fear and relief, and something deeper that had been building between them since Eleanor stepped off that train. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cradling her face, as if she might disappear if he let go. "Move into my room," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could second-guess them. "Tonight. I don't want you down the hall anymore. I want you with me." Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. "Are you sure we've only been married 3 weeks?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Jacob interrupted. "When Sam told me those men were here when I thought I might lose you before we even had a chance to really begin. Eleanor, I don't want to waste any more time pretending this is just a business arrangement." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," she said simply, and Jacob felt something tight in his chest finally release. Miguel and Sam returned, then both armed and alert, ready for trouble that had already passed. They found Jacob and Eleanor on the porch, standing closer than propriety might dictate, but not quite touching both, looking somewhat dazed. "The tracks head south," Miguel reported. 5 riders moving fast. They won't be back today." "But they'll be back," Jacob said grimly. "Morrison doesn't give up easily. We need to be ready." Over the next days, the ranch transformed into something resembling a fortress. Jacob brought in 2 more hands, cousins of Miguel's, who were good with guns and horses. Eleanor organized the defenses with military precision, establishing watch schedules and stockpiling ammunition. She also surprised everyone by producing a medical kit from one of her trunks that would have done credit to an army field hospital. "Where did you get all this?" Jacob asked, examining bottles of laudanum and packages of clean bandages. "I told you I prepared for 6 months before coming here," Eleanor reminded him. "I read every account I could find about frontier life. Medical emergencies were a common theme." That night, their first in the shared bedroom, Jacob found himself suddenly nervous as a schoolboy. Eleanor emerged from behind the dressing screen in a simple white nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders for the first time since she'd arrived. In the lamplight, she looked younger, softer, but the steel in her spine was still there in the way she met his eyes directly. "I should tell you," she said quietly, I'm not experienced in the physical aspects of marriage." Jacob moved closer, reaching out to run his fingers through her dark hair. "Neither am I, not really. There were women in town, but never anything meaningful." Eleanor leaned into his touch. "Then we'll learn together." "Together." He agreed and pulled her into his arms. The physical joining that followed was awkward, at first, then tender, then something transcendent that left them both shaking and amazed. Afterward, as Eleanor lay with her head on Jacob's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow, she said, "I think I understand now why they don't tell unmarried women about this. We'd all be quite eager to marry if we knew." Jacob's laughter rumbled through his chest. "Only you would analyze the marriage bed like a scientific experiment." "Not scientific," Eleanor corrected, pressing a kiss to his collarbone. "More like a revelation. Is it always like that?" "I don't know," Jacob admitted, tightening his arms around her, "but I intend to find out." The next morning brought a new challenge in the form of a letter delivered by a writer from town. Jacob read it with an increasingly dark expression, then handed it to Eleanor. "It's from the Cattlemen's Association," he said. "They're calling a meeting to discuss recent disruptions to the peace and prosperity of the region, which means Morrison has friends who want to make trouble for us." Eleanor scanned the letter quickly. "They're questioning your fitness to maintain your ranch in light of the unfortunate incident with the Morrison gang. This is ridiculous. We were defending our property." "Morrison's cousin sits on the association board," Jacob explained, "and several members owe him money or favors. If they vote against us, they could make it impossible to sell our cattle at fair prices, or worse, they could support Morrison's claim that we attacked him unprovoked." "Then we'll go to this meeting," Eleanor said decisively. "We'll tell our side of the story. Eleanor women don't attend association meetings." "Then it's time that changed." Her green eyes flashed with determination. "I'm the one who shot at Morrison. I'm the one who can testify to what really happened. They can't make decisions about our future without hearing from me." Jacob knew that look by now. It was the same expression she'd worn before riding into the stampede, before facing down Mrs. Pritchard, before standing against 5 outlaws. It was the look that said Eleanor Turner had made up her mind, and heaven help anyone who stood in her way. "All right, well," he said, "we'll go together. But Eleanor, these men aren't like Morrison. They're more dangerous because they use laws and money instead of guns. They can destroy us without firing a shot." "Then we'll have to be smarter than they are," Eleanor said simply. "When is this meeting?" "Tomorrow night. In town at the hotel." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Then I need to go to town today. There are some things I need to arrange." "What things?" Jacob asked suspiciously. "Trust me," was all she said, and despite his misgivings, he did. Eleanor returned from town late that afternoon with several packages and a satisfied expression that made Jacob nervous. She wouldn't tell him what she'd been doing, just said he'd find out at the meeting. That night, as they lay together in their bed, she was restless, her mind clearly working on some plan she wouldn't share. "Whatever you're thinking," Jacob said into the darkness, "please be careful. These men have power and they won't hesitate to use it against us." "I know," Eleanor said softly, "but they've made one mistake. They've underestimated us. They think you're just a small rancher they can push around, and they think I'm just a hysterical woman who can be dismissed. We're going to show them they're wrong on both counts." The next evening, they rode into town together, Eleanor sitting beside Jacob on the wagon seat. She was dressed in her finest dress, a deep burgundy silk that she'd been saving for special occasions, with her hair styled in an elaborate arrangement that made her look every inch the Boston lady. But Jacob could see the steel beneath the silk, the warrior dressed for a different kind of battle. The hotel's dining room had been cleared for the meeting, with chairs arranged in rows facing a table where the association board sat. The room was packed with ranchers, all men who turned to stare as Jacob and Eleanor entered. The whispers started immediately growing louder when Eleanor took a seat beside her husband, instead of retiring to the hotel parlor where the few other wives waited. Thomas Morrison, the scarred outlaw's cousin, stood at the front of the room, a man who shared his relatives' cold eyes, but dressed them in respectability. "This meeting is for association members only," he said pointedly, looking at Eleanor. "I'm here as a witness to the events in question," Eleanor replied calmly, "unless the association has decided to make judgments without hearing all the testimony." "Women don't testify at association meetings," Morrison said flatly. "Then perhaps it's time the association entered the modern age." Eleanor stood, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Or would you prefer I take my testimony to the territorial marshal? Instead, I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear how the association is protecting wanted outlaws." The murmur that ran through the room was like wind through grass. Several ranchers shifted uncomfortably. They might not like having a woman at their meeting, but they liked the threat of legal scrutiny even less. "Let her speak," said a voice from the back. Jacob turned to see Tom Mackenzie standing, his face set with determination. "If we're going to judge Turner's actions, we should hear what actually happened." "I agree," said another rancher. Then another. Soon enough voices were raised in support that Morrison had no choice but to give way. "Very well," he said through gritted teeth. "Mrs. Turner may share her account." Eleanor moved to the front of the room with the same grace she'd once used in Boston ballrooms, but there was something different about her now, a presence that commanded attention. "Gentlemen," she began, "3 days ago, 5 armed men came to our ranch while my husband was checking the far pastures. These men, led by the outlaw Jack Morrison, made explicit threats against my husband's life and my own person. They stated their intention to force my husband to accommodate their criminal activities or face violent consequences." "That's a lie," Thomas Morrison burst out. "My cousin said they were simply passing through and this woman attacked them without provocation." Eleanor turned her cool gaze on him. "Your cousin is wanted in 3 territories for cattle rustling, robbery, and assault. Are you really suggesting we take his word over mine?" "You're a woman who's been here less than a month," Morrison shot back. "You don't understand how things work in Texas." "I understand perfectly," Eleanor replied. "I understand that honest ranchers are being terrorized by outlaws, while certain members of this association profit from the chaos. I understand that my husband has built his success through hard work and integrity, which threatens those who prefer to achieve wealth through less honorable means." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Eleanor had just accused members of the Association of Corruption, an unthinkable breach of protocol. "How dare you?" Morrison began, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "I also understand," she continued, raising her voice above the noise, "that several members of this board have outstanding debts to Jack Morrison, debts that would conveniently disappear if my husband were driven from his land." "That's slander," Morrison roared. "No," Eleanor said calmly, producing a sheaf of papers from her bag. "It's documented fact. I spent yesterday in town talking to people, reviewing records at the bank, checking the notices at the land office. Would you like me to read the list of board members who owe money to your cousin? Or perhaps the list of properties that have changed hands under suspicious circumstances after visits from the Morrison gang?" The silence that fell was deafening. Jacob stared at his wife in amazement. In one day, she'd gathered enough information to expose a web of corruption that had been operating for years. "You can't prove anything," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps not in a court of law," Eleanor agreed. "But I think the territorial marshal would be very interested in investigating these coincidences, especially since I've already sent him a telegram detailing the Morrison gang's attack on our ranch. That was the killing blow. If the marshal investigated, every shady deal and illegal arrangement would come to light." The members of the board were looking at each other nervously, calculating their exposure. "I propose," Eleanor said into the silence, "that we end this charade. The association drops any action against my husband. The Morrison gang is officially condemned and barred from association protection, and we all go back to the business of honest ranching. Otherwise, I'll be forced to share my findings with not just the marshal, but also the newspaper. I'm sure the editor would find it a fascinating story." An older rancher named Harrison, who'd been silent until now, slowly stood. "I move to table any action against Jacob Turner and to officially condemn the Morrison gang's activities." "Seconded," Tom McKenzie called out immediately. The vote was overwhelmingly in favor. Thomas Morrison stormed out of the meeting, but not before shooting Eleanor a look of pure venom. She met his gaze steadily, unflinching. As the meeting broke up, ranchers approached Jacob to shake his hand and offer congratulations, though many still eyed Eleanor with a mixture of respect and unease. She'd shown them a different kind of strength, one that didn't rely on guns or fists, but was no less formidable. On the ride home, Jacob couldn't contain his amazement any longer. "How did you know about the debts, the land deals?" "Mrs. Henderson at the bank is very chatty if you bring her tea and cookies," Eleanor said with a slight smile. "And the clerk at the land office was happy to help once I mentioned I was trying to protect my husband from false accusations." "People talk, Jacob. You just have to know how to listen." "You're terrifying," Jacob said, but with clear admiration. "I'm practical," Eleanor corrected. "The Morrison gang thought they could use force against us. The association thought they could use politics. They both forgot that information is the most powerful weapon of all." "Where did you learn to think like this?" Eleanor's expression darkened slightly. "Boston society is its own kind of battlefield. The weapons are different, but the strategies are the same. Gather intelligence, identify weaknesses, strike decisively. The only difference here is that the stakes are more honest. We're fighting for our home, not just our social standing." That night, as they celebrated their victory in the privacy of their bedroom, Jacob marveled at the woman he'd married. She was nothing like what he'd wanted, everything he hadn't known he needed, and somehow perfect in her contradictions. "I love you," he said suddenly, the words escaping without thought. Eleanor went still in his arms, then pulled back to look at his face. "You do? God help me, yes. You're maddening and brilliant and brave and absolutely nothing like what I planned, and I love you for all of it." Tears gathered in her green eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't expect to. I thought this would be a practical arrangement, a chance for a new life. But somewhere between that first breakfast and facing down those outlaws, I fell completely in love with you." They came together then with a passion that surprised them both, as if the admission of love had unlocked something primal and needful. Later, tangled in sheets, and each other, Eleanor traced patterns on Jacob's chest and said, "We make a good team." "The best," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. The next weeks passed in a blur of hard work and growing intimacy. The Morrison gang didn't return, though everyone stayed alert. Eleanor's garden began to flourish despite the difficult soil, and she started trading vegetables with neighboring ranches, building relationships with the other wives who had initially shunned her. Her combination of Boston manners and frontier practicality gradually won them over, especially when she shared her medical knowledge and helped deliver 2 babies on neighboring ranches. The real test came with the arrival of the cattle buyers in late autumn. This was make or break time for the ranch. The sales from this year's herd would determine whether they could expand or merely survive. Jacob had always handled the negotiations alone, but this year Eleanor insisted on being involved. "You know the cattle," she said, "but I know numbers. Let me help." The buyers were a mixed group, some honest businessmen, others sharp dealers looking to take advantage of desperate ranchers. They clearly didn't know what to make of Eleanor, who served them excellent coffee and fresh-baked pies while discussing market prices and transportation costs with a thoroughness that left them reeling. "Your wife is unusual," one buyer commented to Jacob after Eleanor had politely but firmly rejected his lowball offer. "She's one of a kind," Jacob agreed with pride. In the end, they got prices 20% higher than the previous year, partly due to the quality of the cattle and partly due to Eleanor's negotiating skills. She had a way of making the buyers compete against each other without seeming to do so, all while maintaining perfect hospitality. "How do you do that?" Jacob asked after the last buyer had left with a signed contract. "Do what? Make them think they're getting a good deal while actually paying more than they planned." Eleanor smiled. "It's all about perception. They see a woman serving pie and assume I'm harmless. By the time they realize I've been analyzing their every word and calculating their margins, it's too late. Never underestimate the power of being underestimated." Winter came early that year with a blue norther that howled down from the plains and dropped the temperature 40 degrees in an hour. The cattle had to be moved to sheltered areas, hay distributed, and ice broken on water troughs daily. It was brutal work, and everyone on the ranch pushed themselves to their limits. Eleanor worked alongside the men without complaint, though Jacob noticed her growing thinner dark circles appearing under her eyes. When he expressed concern, she brushed him off. "We're all tired. When the weather breaks, we'll rest." But the weather didn't break. Storm after storm battered the ranch, and they lost several cattle despite their best efforts. One particularly vicious night with sleet driving sideways and the temperature well below freezing, one of the pregnant cows went into distress. Eleanor and Jacob spent hours in the barn, fighting to save both mother and calf. "The calf is turned wrong." Eleanor set her hands inside the cow, trying to reposition the baby. "I can't quite... there..." The calf finally slid free, but it wasn't breathing. Without hesitation, Eleanor cleared its airways and began rubbing its chest vigorously, breathing into its nostrils. For long moments, nothing happened. Then suddenly the calf gasped, shuddered, and began to breathe. "You did it!" Jacob breathed, but when he looked at Eleanor, she was swaying on her feet. "I'm fine," she said, then promptly collapsed. Jacob caught her before she hit the ground, his heart hammering with fear. She was burning with fever, her skin clammy and pale. He carried her to the house, shouting for Sam to ride for the doctor despite the storm. The next days were a nightmare. Eleanor's fever raged while the storm continued to batter the ranch. The doctor, when he finally arrived, looked grave. "Pneumonia," he said. "She's been pushing herself too hard in this weather. Her body couldn't fight off the infection." Jacob didn't leave her side, bathing her face with cool cloths, spooning broth between her lips. When she was conscious enough to swallow, praying to a god he'd barely thought about in years. Miguel and Sam took over the ranch work without being asked, everyone understanding that Jacob's place was with his wife. On the third night, Eleanor's fever broke. She opened her eyes, focused on Jacob's haggard face, and whispered, "You look terrible." He laughed through his tears, gathering her carefully into his arms. "You nearly died." "But I didn't," she said weakly. "Too stubborn, remember." "Don't ever do that to me again," he said roughly. "I can't lose you, Eleanor. I can't go back to the life I had before you." "You won't have to," she promised, though her voice was barely a whisper. "We're partners, remember? For better or worse. The recovery was slow. Eleanor chafed at being confined to bed. But Jacob was implacable. He brought her books from her trunk, sat with her in the evenings, reading aloud, and generally drove her crazy with his hovering. "I'm not made of glass," she protested one afternoon when he wouldn't let her get up to make dinner. "No, you're made of flesh and blood, and you nearly worked yourself to death," Jacob replied firmly. "You're staying in that bed until the doctor says otherwise." "This is ridiculous. The ranch needs you healthy," Jacob interrupted. "Miguel and Sam and I can handle the work. Your job right now is to get well." Eleanor glared at him, but there was affection in it. "When did you become so bossy?" "When I married a woman who doesn't know her own limits," Jacob replied, kissing her forehead. "Now rest." As winter slowly gave way to spring, Eleanor gradually regained her strength. By the time the wildflowers began to bloom across the prairie, she was back to her old self. Though Jacob noticed she was more careful now, more willing to rest when tired. The garden she'd planted began to show promise, green shoots pushing through the soil she'd enriched with compost and carefully irrigated. The ranch's finances were stable thanks to the good cattle sales, and they were even able to hire another hand to help with the expanding herd. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eleanor said quietly, "I have something to tell you." Jacob looked at her, noting the nervous energy in her posture. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them for a moment, then Jacob was pulling her into his arms, his face buried in her hair. "Are you sure?" "The doctor confirmed it yesterday when he came to check on Mary Mackenzie's baby. I'm about 3 months along." 3 months? That means right after the association meeting, Eleanor confirmed with a slight blush. "Apparently defeating corrupt ranchers is conducive to conception." Jacob laughed, joy bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. "A baby! We're going to have a baby!" "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, and for the first time since he'd known her, she sounded uncertain. "Happy." Jacob pulled back to look at her face. "Eleanor, you've given me everything I never knew I wanted. A true partner, a love I didn't think existed, and now a child. Happy doesn't begin to cover it." She smiled that brilliant smile that transformed her face. "Good, because I have plans for this child. Education, of course, but also practical skills. They'll need to know how to run a ranch, but also how to think, how to question, how to stand up for what's right." "Of course you have plans," Jacob said fondly. "Would you be Eleanor if you didn't?" "I also think we should expand the house," Eleanor continued. "Add a proper study, maybe another bedroom or two." "Two? Well, I don't intend for this child to be an only. Do you?" Jacob thought about the big family he'd always wanted, but never thought he'd have. "No, I don't." "Then we'd better start planning," Eleanor said practically. "And Jacob, I want to teach our children that they can be whatever they choose regardless of what society expects. If we have daughters who want to work cattle or sons who want to study poetry, we'll support them. Even if it causes talk." Eleanor looked out over their land, the ranch they'd built together through blood and sweat and tears. "Especially if it causes talk. We've proven that doing things differently can work. Our children should have that same freedom." As spring turned to summer, Eleanor's pregnancy became obvious, and the town's gossips had a field day discussing how she still rode horses, though she'd switched to a gentle mare and never went far from the house and continued to work in her garden. But the criticism had lost its sting. The ranch was thriving, their marriage was strong, and the future stretched before them, full of promise. The Morrison gang made one last attempt to cause trouble, rustling some cattle from the far pastures, but this time the ranchers banded together to track them down. Eleanor's exposure of the corruption had broken the gang's protection, and they were captured and handed over to the marshal. Jack Morrison was hanged for his crimes, and his cousin Thomas left the territory in disgrace. As Eleanor grew larger with child, she also grew more beautiful in Jacob's eyes. There was something magnificent about her carrying their baby while still maintaining her fierce independence. She modified her trousers to accommodate her expanding belly and continued to scandalize the town by refusing to go into confinement as proper ladies were expected to do. "I'm pregnant, not ill," she said when Mrs. Pritchard made another attempt to shame her into proper behavior. "Fresh air and moderate exercise are good for the baby." Mrs. Pritchard had never quite recovered from Eleanor's initial defiance, but she'd been forced to acknowledge that the Turner Ranch was too successful to ignore. When Eleanor donated money to repair the church roof and organized a school fund for the town's children, even the social maven had to admit that perhaps there was more than one way to be a lady. One hot summer day, as Eleanor worked in her now flourishing garden, she felt the first pains. Jacob was in the far pasture, but Sam was close by and rode for the doctor immediately. By the time Jacob arrived, Eleanor was in full labor, gripping the bedposts and using language that would have made the cowboys blush. "This is considerably less pleasant than conceiving the child," she panted between contractions. Despite his fear, Jacob laughed. "Only you would make jokes while in labor." "It's either that or shoot something," Eleanor replied, then groaned as another contraction hit. The labor was long and difficult, stretching through the night and into the next day. Jacob stayed by her side throughout, letting her crush his hand during the worst of it, wiping her face with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when she flagged. Finally, as dawn broke on the second day, their daughter was born, small but healthy, with Eleanor's green eyes and Jacob's dark hair. Eleanor held her with an expression of wonder, all her usual sharp edges softened by maternal love. "She's perfect," she whispered. "She's going to be just like her mother," Jacob said, touching the baby's tiny fist. "God help us all." Eleanor laughed weakly. "Would that be so terrible?" "Terrible, no. Terrifying, absolutely, but also wonderful." They named her Hope, partly for the future she represented, and partly because Eleanor said any child born into their chaotic life would need all the hope she could get. As Eleanor recovered from the birth, the ranch community rallied around them. Women who had once shunned Eleanor now brought food and offered advice. The ranch hands carved toys for the baby, and Miguel's wife made beautiful blankets. Even Mrs. Pritchard came to call, bringing an elaborate christening gown that had been in her family for generations. "For the baptism," she said stiffly, then softened slightly as she looked at the baby. "She's beautiful, Mrs. Turner. You must be very proud." "We are," Eleanor said simply. "Thank you for the gown. It's lovely." It was the closest thing to a truce they'd ever achieve, but it was enough. Hope's baptism became the social event of the season in Sweetwater, not because Eleanor had planned it that way, but because the entire town seemed determined to witness the formal presentation of the child who'd been born to their most unconventional couple. The small church was packed with ranchers and their families filling every pew while others stood along the walls. Eleanor stood at the altar holding Hope, who was resplendent in Mrs. Pritchard's heirloom gown, while Jacob stood beside them, his hand resting protectively on Eleanor's back. "She's not crying," Mrs. Henderson whispered to her neighbor. "My children all screamed through their baptisms." "That's because she's her mother's daughter," came the reply. "Probably already planning how to reorganize the church." Eleanor heard the whispers but kept her attention on Reverend Morrison, who was speaking about the blessing of children and the responsibility of the community to help raise them in righteousness. When he took Hope to perform the baptism, the baby looked at him with those startling green eyes and grabbed his finger with surprising strength. "Strong grip," the Reverend commented with a smile. "She'll need it in this world." After the ceremony, the reception at the ranch proved that Eleanor had indeed won over most of the community. The yard was full of people enjoying food music from a small band Miguel had arranged, and the sight of tough cowboys taking turns holding the baby with expressions of terrified tenderness. "Never thought I'd see the day," Tom Mackenzie said to Jacob, gesturing at the gathering. "Your wife has managed to unite this town in a way nobody else could have." "She has a talent for the impossible," Jacob agreed, watching Eleanor move through the crowd, somehow managing to hold conversations, direct the food service, and nurse Hope discreetly in the corner of the porch. As the sun began to set and the guests started departing, Eleanor found herself alone with Mary Mackenzie, Tom's new wife, who'd arrived from Kansas just months before. "How do you do it?" Mary asked quietly. "How do you balance everything? The ranch work, the house, the baby, dealing with all these people who judge your every move?" Eleanor adjusted Hope in her arms, considering the question. "I don't balance it, not really. Some days the ranch wins, some days the baby wins, some days I lock myself in the bedroom and cry from exhaustion. But Jacob and I are partners in all of it, and that makes the impossible merely difficult." "Tom's wonderful," Mary said, "but he still expects me to stay in the house to be a proper wife." And what do you want to be? Eleanor asked gently. Useful, Mary said immediately, then looked surprised at her own vehemence. I want to contribute more than just meals and clean clothes. Eleanor smiled. Then start small. Learn the ranch accounts. Men rarely object to their wives handling the boring paperwork. Once you understand the business, you can start making suggestions. Before long, you'll be indispensable. Won't Tom object? Maybe at first, but if you're improving his life and his business, he'll come around. And if he doesn't? Eleanor's smile turned sharp. You know where to find me. The months that followed Hope's baptism brought new challenges and unexpected joys. The baby grew rapidly, proving to be as strong-willed as her mother and as stubborn as her father. She learned to crawl early, immediately heading for whatever was most dangerous in any given room, keeping Eleanor in a constant state of vigilance. She's going to be the death of me, Eleanor said one afternoon after fishing Hope out from under the stove for the third time. How did our mothers survive this with less ambitious children? Jacob suggested scooping up his daughter and tossing her in the air, making her shriek with delight. This one's already planning her escape routes. Eleanor had barely recovered her strength from Hope's birth when the ranch faced a new crisis. A drought settled over the land, weeks without rain, turning the grass brown and brittle. The creek that had never run dry began to slow to a trickle, and the cattle grew thin despite their best efforts to find them forage. We need to sell off some of the herd, Jacob said one evening, his face grim as he reviewed their options. We can't sustain this many with the water situation. Or we could dig a well, Eleanor suggested, looking up from where she was mending one of Hope's tiny dresses. There's underground water here, your creek proves that. We just need to find it. Do you have any idea how expensive that would be? And there's no guarantee we'd hit water. There's no guarantee we won't, Eleanor countered. Jacob selling cattle now means selling at a loss. Everyone's doing it, so the prices are terrible. If we can find water, we can maintain our herd and sell when the prices recover. Jacob rubbed his face tiredly. And if we don't find water, we lose everything. Then we'd better find water, Eleanor said simply. The next day, she rode out with Miguel, studying the land with new eyes. The old vaquero had been skeptical at first, but Eleanor's questions about where grass stayed greenest longest and where animals gathered even in dry times gradually won him over. There, he said, finally pointing to a depression near a cluster of cottonwood trees. If there is water below, it would be there. The trees, they know. Eleanor dismounted and walked the area slowly, Hope strapped to her back in a carrier she'd fashioned from a shawl. She knelt, placing her hand on the ground, feeling for something she couldn't quite name. Here, she said finally. We dig here. Jacob hired a drilling crew with their last reserves of cash, every turn of the drill eating into money they couldn't afford to lose. For days they found nothing but dry earth and rock. The crew wanted to give up to try another spot, but Eleanor insisted they continue. Just a little deeper, she kept saying, until even Jacob began to doubt. Then on the seventh day, when they were down nearly 200 feet and the last of their money was gone, they hit water. It came rushing up clear and cold and plentiful like a blessing from below. The crew cheered. Jacob grabbed Eleanor and spun her around while Hope laughed in her carrier, and even stoic Miguel smiled broadly. They had water enough not just for the current crisis, but to irrigate Eleanor's expanding garden and ensure the ranch's future. How did you know? Jacob asked that night as they celebrated with a special dinner. I didn't know, Eleanor admitted. But I believed. Sometimes that's enough. The well changed everything. While other ranches struggled and sold off their herds at loss, the Double J maintained its cattle, and even bought some premium stock from desperate sellers. Eleanor's garden, now properly irrigated, produced enough vegetables to sell in town, creating another income stream. They hired 2 more hands and began construction on the house expansion Eleanor had planned. But success brought its own challenges. Other ranchers struggling with the drought began to resent the Turners' prosperity. Rumors started that they'd made a deal with the devil, or worse, that Eleanor was a witch who'd summoned the water through dark arts. It's jealousy talking, Jacob said when Eleanor came home from town one day, tight-lipped and angry after being snubbed by several women she'd thought were friends. It's ignorance, Eleanor corrected, unpacking supplies with sharp movements. They'd rather believe in witchcraft than admit a woman might have good instincts about land and water. The situation came to a head when someone poisoned their well. Jacob discovered it when he found 3 dead cattle near the water trough, their bodies rigid with convulsions. He immediately cordoned off the well and sent Sam racing to town for the sheriff. Eleanor was feeding Hope when Jacob told her, and her face went white with rage. "They could have killed us all. Hope drinks water from that well." "We don't know who did it," Jacob said, though his own anger was barely controlled. "Don't we?" Eleanor stood passing Hope to Jacob. "Who's been spreading rumors about witchcraft? Who's losing money while we prosper? Who's bitter enough to risk murdering a baby to get revenge?" She was thinking of Thomas Morrison's remaining allies, the ones who'd never forgiven her for exposing their corruption. Jacob knew she was probably right, but proving it would be another matter. The sheriff, a decent man named Wallace, investigated thoroughly but found no concrete evidence. The poisoning could have been anyone with access to the ranch, which meant half the county during the recent barn raising they'd hosted. "We need to be careful," Wallace warned. "Whoever did this might try again." Eleanor's response was characteristic. Instead of retreating in fear, she went on the offensive. She hired a water expert from San Antonio to test not just their well, but all the water sources in the area. What he found was shocking traces of the same poison in 3 other wells, all belonging to ranchers who'd opposed the Morrison gang. "Someone's trying to drive out anyone who won't play by their rules," Eleanor told a packed town meeting she'd called to share the findings. "This isn't about the Double J. This is about controlling the whole region through fear and sabotage." The revelation united the ranchers in a way that prosperity never could have. They formed a protective association with rotating guards for each ranch's water supply. The poisoner, perhaps realizing the community had united against them, never struck again, though they were never caught either. Through all of this, Hope grew from baby to toddler, taking her first steps on her first birthday, much to everyone's delight and terror. She had her mother's fearless nature and her father's stubborn streak, a combination that kept everyone on the ranch constantly vigilant. "She's trying to climb the corral fence again," Sam reported one afternoon, carrying a squirming Hope back to the house. "Of course she is," Eleanor sighed, taking her mud-covered daughter. "Hope, sweetheart, the horses are not toys." "Horse," Hope declared happily, her current favorite word along with no and mine. "She's going to be a handful when she's older," Jacob said, watching his daughter charm Sam into giving her a piece of candy. "She's a handful now," Eleanor corrected. "But she's also brave and curious and determined. She'll need all of those qualities in this world." As Hope grew, so did Eleanor's influence in the community. The success of the water testing had established her as someone to be reckoned with, and gradually other women began coming to her for advice. Not just about domestic matters, but about business, about standing up to their husbands, about claiming their own place in the frontier society. "You're starting a revolution," Jacob told her one evening after she'd spent the afternoon teaching 5 ranch wives how to read account ledgers. "I'm starting nothing," Eleanor replied, bouncing Hope on her knee. "I'm simply showing them what they're already capable of. These women are strong, Jacob. They've survived childbirth in sod houses, rattlesnakes in their kitchens, isolation that would break most people. They just need someone to tell them their strength matters." The revolution, if that's what it was, gained momentum when Eleanor organized the region's first harvest festival. It was ostensibly a celebration of the season's crops, but it became something more, a showcase of what the women of the region could accomplish. There were quilts and preserves, of course, but also Eleanor's vegetables, Mary Mackenzie's leather goods, and Susan Harrison's furniture designs. "My husband nearly fainted when I told him I wanted to sell my chairs," Susan confided to Eleanor as they set up the displays. "But when I showed him the order from the hotel in San Antonio, he changed his tune quick enough." The festival was a massive success, drawing visitors from as far as Austin. Eleanor had arranged for a photographer to document the event, and the image of her standing with Hope on her hip, surrounded by the other ranch women, all of them smiling proudly beside their wares, became iconic in the region. But success always comes with a price. Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again, just as the ranch faced its biggest challenge. Yet a massive storm system that threatened to flood the entire valley. The creek that had been their lifeline was now a raging torrent, and the new well was in danger of contamination from runoff. We need to move the cattle to higher ground, Jacob said, studying the darkening sky. All of them immediately. That's 300 head, Miguel pointed out. We'll need every hand, and even then, we'll do it, Eleanor said firmly, already reaching for her rain slicker. We have to. Eleanor, no, Jacob said immediately. You're pregnant. You can't. I can and I will, she interrupted. We need every available person, and I can still ride. I'll take the drag position away from the main danger. They argued briefly but intensely, but Eleanor won as she usually did when she'd made up her mind. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, every person on the ranch, including Eleanor with Hope, secured at the house with Miguel's wife, rode out to move the herd. The work was nightmarish. Rain fell in sheets, turning the ground to mud that sucked at the horses' hooves. Lightning split the sky, spooking the cattle and making every moment dangerous. Eleanor, true to her word, stayed at the back of the herd, but even that position was treacherous as the ground became increasingly unstable. They were halfway to higher ground when disaster struck. A lightning strike near the lead cattle caused them to wheel back, and suddenly the organized drive became a chaotic mass of frightened animals. Eleanor saw Jacob's horse go down in the mud, saw him roll clear just as the cattle surged toward him. Without thinking, she spurred her horse forward, riding hard through the rain and mud. She reached Jacob just as the first cattle arrived, hauling him up behind her as she'd once done with Sam. But this time there was nowhere to go. They were surrounded by panicking animals. "The rocks!" Jacob shouted in her ear, pointing to an outcropping barely visible through the rain. Eleanor turned her horse toward it, the animal responding to her desperate commands despite its own fear. They made it to the relative safety of the rocks, just as the main body of the herd thundered past, close enough that Eleanor could feel the heat of their bodies. When the chaos finally ended, when the cattle had been gathered and moved to safety, Jacob and Eleanor stood in the rain, holding each other, both shaking from the close call. "You saved my life," Jacob said against her wet hair. "Again." "We saved each other," Eleanor corrected, then gasped and doubled over. "Eleanor? The baby!" she managed through gritted teeth. "Something's wrong!" The ride back to the house was a nightmare of a different kind. Eleanor clung to consciousness as Jacob rode hard through the storm, shouting for Miguel to fetch the doctor. By the time they reached home, she was pale and bleeding, her body trying to expel the child too soon. The doctor worked through the night with Jacob pacing outside the bedroom door and Hope crying for her mother. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, but Eleanor had lost the baby. She woke to find Jacob beside her, his face haggard with worry and grief. "The baby?" she asked, though she already knew from the pain in his eyes. "Gone," he said roughly. "But you're alive. That's what matters." Eleanor turned her face away, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. It was the first time Jacob had seen her cry since they'd met, and it broke his heart. The recovery was different this time, not just physical, but emotional. Eleanor went through the motions of daily life, but the spark that usually animated her was dimmed. She held Hope closer but seemed distant, as if she was physically present but mentally elsewhere. "She blames herself," Mary Mackenzie told Jacob when she came to visit. "She thinks the riding the strain of the storm caused the loss." "That's ridiculous," Jacob said. "The doctor said it could have happened anyway." "Since when has logic ever helped with grief?" Mary asked gently. It was Hope who finally broke through Eleanor's depression. The toddler, with the instinct children have for their parents' emotions, became increasingly clingy and demanding, refusing to let Eleanor sink into her sorrow. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat listlessly on the porch, Hope brought her a handful of wildflowers crushed and wilted from being clutched in small fists. "Mama, pretty," Hope said, trying to stick the flowers in Eleanor's hair. "Mama smiled." Eleanor looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw Jacob's determination in the set of her small jaw, saw her own stubbornness in those green eyes. This child needed her mother not just present, but truly there. "Yes, sweetheart," Eleanor said, pulling Hope into her lap and breathing in her little girl scent of dirt and sunshine. "Mama will smile." The healing wasn't immediate, but it began that day. Eleanor threw herself back into ranch work with renewed determination, as if trying to prove that the loss hadn't broken her. She expanded the garden again, started a correspondence with an agricultural college about improved irrigation techniques, and began teaching Hope her letters, despite Jacob's protest that she was too young. "She's never too young to learn Eleanor insisted, watching Hope carefully trace an A in the dirt. "Knowledge is power, and I want our daughter to have all the power she can get." The ranch prospered despite the emotional setback. The cattle they'd saved from the flood commanded high prices. The garden produced enough to supply 2 restaurants in San Antonio, and their horses were gaining a reputation for quality throughout Texas. Then came the letter that changed everything. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by special courier from Austin. Eleanor read it twice, then handed it to Jacob with shaking hands. "What is it?" he asked, alarmed by her expression. "My aunt in Boston died. She left me everything, the house, the investments, nearly $50,000. Jacob stared at the letter, the sum staggering. It was more money than most people saw in a lifetime, enough to transform the ranch into an empire or to leave it entirely. "We could go back," Eleanor said quietly, "to Boston. Hope could have the best education, the opportunities I had. We could live in comfort without the constant struggle." Jacob felt his heart stop. After everything they'd built, was she really considering leaving? Eleanor must have seen the fear in his face, because she quickly continued, "Or we could use it to build something extraordinary here. Buy more land, improve the breeding programs, maybe even start that school you've heard me talk about." "What do you want?" Jacob asked carefully. Eleanor looked out over their land at the garden she'd coaxed from stubborn soil, at the cattle grazing peacefully, at Hope, playing in the yard with a stick she was pretending was a horse. "I want to stay," she said firmly. "This is our home, but I want to use this windfall to make it better, not just for us, but for everyone. A school where girls and boys can learn together, a medical clinic so women don't have to deliver babies alone, maybe even a library." "That's ambitious," Jacob said, but he was smiling. "When have I ever been anything else?" Eleanor asked, and for the first time since losing the baby, her smile reached her eyes. The transformation of Sweetwater began slowly but deliberately. Eleanor started with the school, a modest building that could hold 20 students. She hired a teacher from Dallas, a young woman named Catherine, who shared Eleanor's belief that education shouldn't be limited by gender or social class. The resistance was immediate and predictable. Several ranchers refused to send their children to a school run by that Turner woman, and Mrs. Pritchard organized a formal protest claiming Eleanor was trying to corrupt the youth with radical ideas. "Let them protest," Eleanor said calmly as she and Catherine arranged desks in the new schoolhouse. "When their children see others learning to read and write and calculate, they'll change their minds." She was right. Within a month, even the holdouts were sending their children to the school, unable to deny the value of education, even if they disagreed with Eleanor's methods. The medical clinic came next, staffed by a doctor Eleanor lured from San Antonio with the promise of a house and steady salary. The first baby delivered there was Mary Mackenzie's son, and when both mother and child survived what would have been a dangerous breech birth, even the skeptics had to admit the clinic's value. "You're changing everything," Jacob told Eleanor one evening as they walked through town, noting the new buildings, the improved roads, the general air of prosperity that had settled over Sweetwater. "We're changing everything," Eleanor corrected, taking his arm. "None of this would be possible without your support." "My support? I just try to keep up with your plans." "That's the most important support of all," Eleanor said seriously. "You let me be who I am, Jacob. Do you have any idea how rare that is?" As Hope grew from toddler to child, she absorbed her parents' partnership as naturally as breathing. She worked alongside her father with the cattle and learned accounts from her mother. She could ride before she could properly walk and could calculate feed ratios before she mastered long division. "She's going to be formidable," Catherine, the teacher, told Eleanor after Hope, at age 4, corrected an older student's grammar during class. "Good," Eleanor replied. "The world needs formidable women." The world also apparently needed Eleanor to have another child. She discovered she was pregnant again just as Hope turned 5, and this time she was terrified. The loss of the second baby still haunted her, and she found herself being uncharacteristically careful, avoiding riding, limiting her work, resting when tired. "This isn't like you," Jacob said one evening, finding her in bed before sunset. "I can't lose another one," Eleanor admitted quietly. I don't think I could survive it. Jacob sat beside her, taking her hand. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. But Eleanor, you can't live in fear. That's not who you are. She squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. You're right. Fear doesn't change outcomes, does it? Not that I've noticed. So Eleanor returned to her modified version of normal life, careful, but not paralyzed. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and on a beautiful spring morning, she delivered a healthy son they named James after Jacob's father. A boy, Jacob said, holding his son with an expression of wonder. I have a son. You have a child, Eleanor corrected gently. Boy or girl, they're ours to raise as best we can. James proved to be as different from Hope as two siblings could be. Where she was bold and outgoing, he was quiet and observant. Where she rushed toward every challenge, he hung back, analyzing before acting. But he had his own strength, a quiet determination that reminded Eleanor of Jacob in his steadier moments. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the largest operations in the region. They employed 15 full-time hands, now many with families who lived on the property. Eleanor had built houses for them, proper homes with gardens and chicken coops, creating a small community within the ranch boundaries. It's like a town unto itself, observed a journalist from Houston who'd come to write about the unusual partnership of the Turner Ranch. That's the idea of it, Eleanor told him as she showed him around. People work better when they're treated as valuable members of a community, not just hired hands. The article, when it was published, caused a sensation. It described Eleanor as a frontier revolutionary, praised Jacob's progressive thinking, and held up their ranch as a model for modern agricultural operations. Letters poured in from across the country, some praising, others condemning, but all taking notice. We're famous, Jacob said dryly, reading a particularly vitriolic letter from a rancher in Montana who accused them of destroying traditional values. We're notorious, Eleanor corrected, bouncing James on her knee while Hope practiced writing at the kitchen table. There's a difference. Is there? Famous people are admired. Notorious people change things. The change Eleanor had started rippled outward in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Other ranchers' wives began asserting themselves, demanding partnership rather than subservience. The school she'd founded became a model for rural education. The medical clinic expanded to serve 3 counties. But with influence came responsibility, and Eleanor found herself stretched thin. Trying to manage the ranch raised 2 children and respond to the constant requests for advice and assistance. She was reviewing applications for a new teacher position when Jacob found her asleep at her desk, her head pillowed on her arms. You need help, he said when she woke. I have help. I have you. You need more help, Jacob insisted. What about hiring an assistant? Someone to handle correspondence and scheduling? Eleanor considered this. It would have to be someone special, someone who understands what we're trying to do here. That someone turned out to be Margaret Foster, a young widow from Chicago, who'd answered Eleanor's carefully worded advertisement seeking an assistant for unconventional ranch operation. Margaret was educated, efficient, and unfazed by Eleanor's various projects. I ran my husband's business after he died, Margaret explained during her interview, until his family forced me out because a woman shouldn't be in commerce. I'm tired of being told what women shouldn't do. Then you'll fit in perfectly here, Eleanor said, hiring her on the spot. With Margaret's help, Eleanor was able to expand her influence even further. They started a newsletter for ranch women sharing practical advice and subtle encouragement for independence. They organized an annual conference that brought together progressive ranchers and their wives to share innovations and ideas. Hope, now 7, and James too grew up in this atmosphere of constant activity and innovation. Hope helped with the newsletter, her careful handwriting addressing envelopes to subscribers across Texas. James, though younger, showed an early aptitude for mechanics, fascinated by the new windmill Jacob had installed to pump water. He's going to be an engineer, Eleanor predicted, watching James carefully examine the windmill's gears. He's 2, Jacob laughed. Maybe let him be a baby a bit longer. But Eleanor was already envisioning futures for her children that went beyond the traditional paths society would expect them to follow. The years that followed proved Eleanor's predictions right in ways that even she couldn't have imagined. James did become an engineer, eventually designing irrigation systems that transformed agriculture across Texas. Hope became the first woman to manage a cattle operation in the state, running the Double J with a combination of her mother's innovation and her father's steady wisdom. But on this autumn evening in 1903, 20 years after Eleanor had stepped off that train in Sweetwater, all of that was still in the future. Jacob found Eleanor where he often did these days, sitting on the porch in the rocking chair he'd made for her 40th birthday, watching Hope and James race their horses across the near pasture. At 17, Hope rode with the same fearless grace her mother had shown at that age, while 12-year-old James followed with careful precision, calculating the best angle for each turn. "They're magnificent," Eleanor said softly, as Jacob settled into the chair beside her. "They're wild," Jacob corrected, but his voice was warm with pride. "Hope's been teaching James to shoot while standing on horseback." "A useful skill," Eleanor said mildly, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. "You never know when one might need to defend the ranch while performing circus tricks." Jacob laughed, reaching over to take her hand. 20 years of ranch work had weathered it, but to him it was more beautiful than the soft, pale hand he'd first held at their wedding. These hands had delivered calves, fired rifles at outlaws, built a school, held their children through fever and heartbreak, and transformed not just their ranch, but their entire community. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Answering my advertisement. Coming to Texas." Eleanor turned to look at him, and even after 2 decades, those green eyes could still stop his heart. "How can you ask that? Everything I am, everything we've built started with that decision. You could have had an easier life." "I could have had a quieter life," Eleanor corrected, "but quiet was never what I wanted, even when I pretended otherwise." She squeezed his hand. "I wanted purpose, partnership, the freedom to be myself completely. You gave me all of that, Jacob Turner." "You took it," Jacob said. "I just tried not to get in your way." "You did more than that. You stood beside me when the whole town thought I was insane. You supported my wild schemes even when they risked everything. You let our daughter wear trousers and learn to shoot, and you're letting our son read engineering books instead of forcing him to focus only on cattle." "Well," Jacob said with a slow smile, "I learned early on that fighting a force of nature is pointless. Better to harness it instead." Hope and James had finished their race and were walking their horses back to the barn, arguing good-naturedly about who had actually won. Eleanor watched them with the satisfaction of a woman who had achieved something remarkable not through conquest but through partnership. "Mrs. Pritchard came to see me today," Eleanor said casually. Jacob groaned. "What does the old battle-axe want now?" "To apologize, actually." Eleanor's voice held wonder. "Her granddaughter wants to attend university to become a doctor. Mrs. Pritchard wanted to know how I'd raised Hope to be so confident, so capable. She said, and I quote, 'Perhaps I was wrong about some things.'" "Only some things. It's Mrs. Pritchard. We take victories where we can get them." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that rivaled Eleanor's first sunset in Texas. The ranch spread before them, not just the original 2,000 acres, but 10,000 now, with innovative irrigation systems, a horse breeding program that supplied the U.S. cavalry and cattle that commanded premium prices from Chicago to New York. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said, using the tone that after 20 years still made Jacob both excited and nervous. "Should I be worried?" "Possibly." She turned to face him fully. "I want to write a book about our story about what's possible when men and women work as true partners. Margaret thinks there would be great interest back east. You want to tell everyone about the wife who wore trousers and shot at outlaws. I want to tell everyone about the husband who let her," Eleanor said softly, "who saw her not as a threat to his authority, but as an asset to their shared dreams. That's the real revolution, Jacob. Not that women can do men's work, but that when we work together, we can build something neither could achieve alone." Jacob considered this, watching their children unsaddle their horses with practiced efficiency. Hope was showing James a better way to check the horse's hooves, and he was listening with respectful attention despite being naturally prideful. They'd learned partnership from their parents' example. "Write your book," he said finally. "Tell our story. Maybe it will help some other man realize that a quiet wife isn't nearly as valuable as a wild one. Eleanor laughed, that rich, genuine sound that still made his heart race. You know what the funny thing is? You did get what you asked for in a way. You wanted a wife who would make your life easier, and I have just not in the way you expected. How do you figure that your life is easier because you're not facing it alone? Every challenge, every triumph, every decision, we share them. That's the ultimate ease, Jacob, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of partnership. As if to underscore her point, Hope called out from the barn. Papa Mama James found a problem with the windmill pump. They rose together, hands still linked, and walked toward their children. Eleanor no longer moved with the quick, aggressive energy of her youth, and Jacob's stride had slowed from years of hard work, but they moved in sync unconsciously, matching each other's pace. 20 years, Jacob murmured as they approached the barn. 20 years since you stepped off that train and ruined all my plans. Best thing that ever happened to you, Eleanor said cheekily. The absolute best, Jacob agreed, pulling her close for a kiss that made their children groan in embarrassment. As they worked together to fix the windmill, Hope holding the lantern, James explaining the mechanical issue. Eleanor suggesting a solution, and Jacob implementing it, the truth of their life together crystallized. They had started as strangers seeking practical solutions to loneliness and survival. They had become something unprecedented in their time and place, true partners in every sense of the word. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in the room they'd shared for 2 decades, Eleanor said, I never told you what I first thought when I saw you at the train station. What? I thought, this man has no idea what he's gotten himself into. Jacob laughed, pulling her into his arms. You were right. I wanted a quiet wife to complete my predetermined life. Instead, I got you, and you created a completely different life, one I couldn't have imagined but can't imagine living without. No regrets? Eleanor asked, echoing his earlier question. Only one, Jacob said seriously. Eleanor pulled back to look at his face, concerned. What? I wish I'd sent for you sooner. She smiled, that brilliant expression that had first undone him and continued to light his world. We found each other when we were meant to, Jacob Turner. Any sooner, and we might not have been ready for what we could become together. Outside, a coyote howled across the Texas prairie, wild and free and utterly untamed. Inside, 2 people who had built an empire on partnership, respect, and the radical notion that marriage could be a meeting of equals rather than a surrender of identity fell asleep in each other's arms. The Double J Ranch would continue for generations, run by descendants who carried forward the legacy of partnership that Eleanor and Jacob had established. The school Eleanor founded would become a model for rural education across the West. The stories of the woman who wore trousers and faced down outlaws would become legend told around campfires and in history books. But in that moment, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, they were simply Jacob and Eleanor Turner, the cowboy who'd wanted a quiet wife, and the wild woman who'd given him something infinitely better, a life worth living and a love worth fighting for. The last thing Jacob thought before sleep claimed him was what he'd realized that first morning when Eleanor had made breakfast for everyone. Some storms weren't meant to be weathered, but embraced. And Eleanor Hayes Turner had been the best storm that ever blew into his life, transforming the landscape of his existence into something magnificent.